Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the comfort of streetlights and neighborhoods and set out onto Ohio's endless highways, roads that stretch across farmland, snake through small forgotten towns, and cut through dense woods where the night feels heavier than anywhere else. Out here, the darkness isn't empty. It waits. For truckers, these stretches of Ohio asphalt are more than just long hauls. They are places where headlights catch figures that vanish, where ghost towns breathe in the wind, and where the quiet hum of your engine is the only thing reminding you that you're still awake. These highways carry stories of whispers on the CB, of hitchhikers who never should have been there, and of shadows that follow rigs for miles before melting back into the trees. These 10 true nightmares come from truckers who've driven Ohio's darkest roads and lived to tell the tale. Each one is a chilling reminder that sometimes the real danger isn't the curves, the weather, or the fatigue, but what waits in the dark just beyond your headlights. If you're new to Horror Whispers, don't forget to subscribe for daily true horror stories that peel back the veil on the world around us. And make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss the tales others are too afraid to share. So settle in, turn off the lights, and keep your eyes on the road ahead. Tonight we're diving into 10 true trucker nightmares from Ohio's dark highways. My name is Mike Patterson, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years. I've seen everything you can imagine on America's highways. Accidents that would make your stomach turn, weather that could kill you in minutes, and people doing things that defy common sense. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at that rest stop on I-71 just south of Columbus. It was a Tuesday night in October around 2:15 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been checking my logbook, making sure I wasn't pushing my hours too hard. The dispatcher had me running a load of auto parts from Detroit down to Atlanta, and I was making good time despite the scattered fog that had been rolling in and out all evening. My CB was quiet except for the occasional trucker checking in with smoky reports, and I had my thermos of coffee half empty on the console beside me. I'd been driving this route for years, probably hundreds of times, and I knew every rest stop, every truck stop, every good place to grab a bite or take a leak. The rest area at mile marker 89 wasn't my favorite. It was one of those older state facilities that felt like it had been forgotten by the maintenance crews. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through. The picnic tables were covered in graffiti, and the restroom buildings looked like they hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. But it was convenient, it was free, and most importantly, it was legal for my mandatory rest break. I pulled my rig into one of the truck parking spaces. There were only about 6 designated spots, and mine was the only truck there at that hour. The parking lot was dimly lit by a handful of sodium lights, half of which were flickering like they were about to give up entirely. As I set my air brakes and killed the engine, I noticed how quiet everything was. Usually, even at rest stops in the middle of nowhere, you hear something. Traffic on the highway, maybe an owl, or the distant sound of another truck engine cooling down. But this place was silent as a tomb. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the restroom building. The men's room was on the left side of a concrete block structure that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s. The women's room was on the right. Both sides had those heavy wooden doors that hung crooked and never quite closed properly. As I walked across the parking lot, my boots echoed off the pavement, and I could smell that distinctive rest stop combination of diesel fumes, old cigarettes, and whatever cleaning chemicals they used in the restrooms. The men's room was about what you'd expect. 2 urinals, 1 stall. Everything covered in the kind of grime that comes from years of minimal maintenance. I did my business quickly and was washing my hands at the rust-stained sink when I heard it. A scream. Not a shout, not someone calling for help, but a full-throated, terror-filled scream that seemed to come from the women's restroom next door. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold, the kind that tells you someone is in mortal danger. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I dried my hands quickly and stepped outside, looking around the parking lot. My truck was still the only vehicle there. The highway was visible about 50 yards away, and I could see the occasional car passing by, but nothing had pulled into the rest area. I walked over to the women's restroom and called out, "Hey, is everything okay in there? Do you need help?" No answer. I waited a moment, then called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Is someone in there?" I heard screaming. Still nothing. Now I'm not the kind of guy who goes barging into women's restrooms, but something about that scream had shaken me. It wasn't the scream of someone who was startled or even hurt in a normal way. It was the scream of someone who was absolutely terrified, someone who thought they were about to die. So I pushed the door open just a crack and called inside. "I'm coming in to check if you're okay. If you're in here, please say something." The restroom was dark. The motion sensor lights should have kicked on, but they didn't. I used my flashlight to sweep the interior. It was a mirror image of the men's room. 2 stalls, a sink, the same institutional tile and concrete, block construction. Both stall doors were standing open. The room was completely empty. I checked both stalls thoroughly, even looked under the sinks and behind the door. Nobody was there. Nobody could have been there. There was only one door, and I'd been standing right outside it since I heard the scream. But as I was leaving, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The motion sensor light above the sink was working fine. It had come on when I walked in, which meant that if someone had been in that restroom when I heard the scream, the lights would have been on. But they were off when I first looked in. I walked back to my truck, telling myself that maybe the scream had come from the highway, that sound travels in funny ways at night, that maybe it had been an animal or something. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew where it had come from. I was just climbing back into my cab when I heard it again. This time the scream was longer, more intense, and it was definitely coming from that women's restroom. I grabbed my flashlight and ran back across the parking lot, my heart pounding. I threw open the restroom door without hesitation this time, and the motion lights flickered on immediately. Empty. Completely empty. But the scream was still going on. I stood there in that empty restroom, listening to the most horrible sound I'd ever heard in my life, and it was coming from all around me. Not from the stalls, not from outside, but from the walls themselves, like the concrete blocks were screaming. The sound echoed off the tile and seemed to get louder and louder until I thought my eardrums were going to burst. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the screaming. I could hear my own breathing, my heart hammering in my chest, and the buzz of the fluorescent lights above me. I swept my flashlight beam around the room one more time, and that's when I saw something that nearly made me lose it completely. There were wet handprints on the mirror above the sink. Not water wet, something dark and thick that looked like it was still dripping. As I watched, more prints appeared, as if invisible hands were pressing against the glass from the other side. I backed out of that restroom and ran to my truck. I didn't walk, I didn't hurry. I ran like the devil himself was chasing me. I fired up the engine and got out of there so fast I probably left rubber on the asphalt. The next morning, when I was more composed and wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, I called the Ohio Department of Transportation. I told them there might be some kind of emergency at the rest stop, that I'd heard screaming and thought someone might be in trouble. They said they'd send a maintenance crew to check it out. 3 days later, I called back to follow up. The maintenance supervisor told me they'd checked the facility thoroughly and hadn't found any sign of disturbance. But then he said something that made my blood run cold all over, again. "You're not the first person to report screaming at that location," he said. "We've had 3 similar calls in the past month. Always late at night, always from truckers, always the same story. Someone screaming in the women's restroom, but nobody there when we check." I asked him if they'd looked into it further, maybe checked with local police or installed security cameras. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "We've got cameras there now. Funny thing is, they never pick up anything when the screaming is reported. But the audio sensors, they definitely pick up the screaming. I never stopped at that rest area again. Hell, I changed my route entirely to avoid that section of I-71. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night and the CB is quiet and the highway stretches out empty ahead of me, I think about those handprints on the mirror and wonder what kind of terror could be so intense that it leaves an impression on a place years after whatever happened there." The maintenance supervisor had mentioned other truckers reporting the same thing. I started asking around at truck stops, being casual about it, just mentioning that stretch of I-71 and seeing if anyone else had stories. Turns out quite a few drivers had experienced something similar. Most were reluctant to talk about it. Truckers are a practical bunch, and admitting you've heard ghostly screaming doesn't exactly fit that image. But late one night at a pilot in Kentucky, I was having coffee with an older driver named Earl who'd been running Ohio routes for 30 years. When I mentioned the rest stop, his face went pale. "You heard her too," he said. It wasn't a question. "Her?" Earl looked around the nearly empty truck stop restaurant, then leaned in closer. "Back in '92, there was a woman murdered at that rest stop. College student traveling alone at night. Someone grabbed her when she went into the restroom. Did terrible things to her before." He shook his head. "They never caught who did it." Case went cold. "How do you know all this?" "Because I was the one who found her body the next morning. Earl told me he'd pulled in around 6 a.m. for his mandatory break, just like I had. He'd gone into the men's room and heard what he thought was someone crying in the women's room. When he called out and got no response, he'd pushed the door open and found her. Worst thing I ever saw in my life," he said. "And I saw plenty in Vietnam. But that poor girl. She'd been there all night, scared and alone and knowing she was going to die." The official investigation had concluded that the killer was probably another traveler, someone who'd been watching the rest stop and waiting for a victim. The woman had been a nursing student from Ohio State, driving home to see her parents in Cincinnati. She'd stopped at that rest area around 2 a.m., just like I had. "You think she's still there?" I asked Earl. He stared into his coffee cup for a long time before answering. "I think terror like that, it doesn't just go away. I think it leaves a mark on a place, and maybe, just maybe, she's still trying to scream for help." I left that conversation more unsettled than ever. Over the years, I've talked to dozens of drivers who've had experiences on Ohio's highways that they couldn't explain. But that rest stop seems to be a focal point for something dark and terrible. The last time I spoke with someone from ODOT about it was about 5 years ago. The maintenance supervisor I'd originally talked to had retired, but his replacement knew about the reports. He told me they'd actually considered closing that rest area entirely because of the number of complaints, but budget constraints had kept it open. "We did install better lighting and security cameras," he said. "But between you and me, we still get reports. Not as many, but they still come in. Always the same thing, screaming from the women's restroom, nobody there when we check." I asked if they'd ever considered having the place investigated by paranormal experts or someone like that. He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Officially, the state of Ohio doesn't recognize paranormal activity," he said. "Unofficially, let's just say there are some rest stops that our maintenance crews prefer to visit during daylight hours. These days, when I'm training new drivers or talking to younger truckers, I always warn them about certain stretches of highway in Ohio. I don't always go into detail. Most people aren't ready to hear about screaming ghosts and bloody handprints. But I tell them to trust their instincts, to stay alert, and to remember that sometimes the scariest things on the highway aren't the ones you can see coming in your headlights. That rest stop is still there, still operational. According to the ODOT website, it's received some upgrades over the years. New picnic tables, better lighting, renovated restroom facilities. But I notice they don't mention anything about the screaming. Sometimes I wonder about that nursing student, what her name was, what her dreams were, whether she had brothers and sisters who still miss her. I wonder if she knows that her story has been passed along from trucker to trucker, that we remember her even if we never knew her name. And I wonder if someday, somehow, she'll find the peace to stop screaming. But until then, I'll keep taking the long way around that section of I-71. Because some things you hear on the highway stay with you forever, and some roads are better left untraveled after dark. I'm Jenny Martinez, and I need to tell you about the worst night of my trucking career. Not because of what happened to my rig, but because of what I saw when it happened. I've been driving for 7 years now, ever since my divorce, when I needed to make good money fast to support my 2 kids. Trucking gave me that chance, and I've always been grateful for it. I'm a safe driver, never had a major accident, never even had a serious citation. My company trusted me with their best loads, and I took pride in that. The route I was running that night was one I'd driven probably 50 times before. I-23 south through central Ohio, carrying a load of electronics from Toledo down to Lexington. It was early November, cold but clear, with good visibility and light traffic. Perfect conditions for making time and staying safe. I'd left Toledo around 8 p.m. and was planning to push through to Kentucky, grab some sleep at a truck stop I knew there, then make my delivery first thing in the morning. Everything was going perfectly until I hit the section of highway they call Devil's Curve. It's not an official name. You won't find it on any road signs or maps. But every trucker who runs that route knows exactly which curve I'm talking about. It's about 15 miles south of Delaware, Ohio, where the highway takes a sweeping left turn around a small hill. The curve itself isn't particularly sharp, nothing that would challenge an experienced driver in good conditions. But it has a reputation. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every truck stop has its collection of highway legends, and Devil's Curve was always good for a few tales over coffee. Drivers would talk about feeling their rigs start to slide for no reason, about seeing things in their mirrors that couldn't be there, about an unusually high number of accidents on that particular stretch of road. I'd always figured it was just one of those places where the road geometry or weather patterns created challenging conditions, combined with a healthy dose of trucker superstition. That night I approached the curve at a conservative 62 miles per hour, well within the posted speed limit and appropriate for my load weight. The weather was perfect, visibility was excellent, and my rig was running smoothly. I'd been driving for about 2.5 hours, was feeling alert and comfortable, and had already decided to push on past my original planned stopping point since I was making such good time. As I entered the curve, I did what I always do, checked my mirrors to make sure my trailer was tracking properly, adjusted my position slightly to keep centered in my lane, and maintained steady pressure on the throttle to avoid any sudden power changes that might upset the load. Standard procedure for any curve, especially with a high-value load like electronics. That's when it happened. Without any warning, without any change in road conditions or anything wrong with my driving, my trailer started to slide. Not a gentle drift that you might feel if the road was slick or if you'd taken the curve too fast, but a sudden violent slide to the right as if someone had grabbed the back of my trailer and yanked it sideways. I immediately took my foot off the throttle and began the standard jackknife recovery procedure, counter-steering gently, avoiding the brakes, trying to get the trailer back in line behind the tractor. But nothing I did had any effect. The trailer kept sliding, and I could feel the whole rig starting to fold in the middle as the angle between the tractor and trailer became more and more severe. In the maybe 10 seconds it took for the jackknife to develop fully, I had time to run through everything in my mind. The road was dry. I could see it clearly in my headlights. My speed had been conservative. My load was properly secured and well within weight limits. My tires were in good condition and properly inflated. There was no mechanical reason for what was happening. But as I fought to control the rig, I glanced in my driver's side mirror to see how bad the jackknife was getting. And that's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. There were faces in the mirror. Not reflections of my own face or anything inside the cab, but other faces. The faces of people I'd never seen before. They were pale and distorted with expressions of absolute terror, and they seemed to be reaching toward me from inside the mirror itself. There were dozens of them, all crowded together, all screaming silently, all trying to get my attention. I blinked hard, sure that I was seeing things, that the stress of the jackknife was making me hallucinate. But when I looked again, the faces were still there, and now I could see that some of them were wearing clothing from different eras. A woman in what looked like a 1980s business suit, a man in work clothes that looked older, a teenager in a varsity jacket that could have been from the 1990s. The rig continued its inexorable slide across the highway, and I knew I was going to end up in the ditch or worse. I braced for impact, said a quick prayer for my kids, and tried one last time to regain control. That's when one of the faces in the mirror, the woman in the business suit, seemed to look directly at me and mouth a single word: brake. Every instinct I had as a professional driver told me not to hit the brakes during a jackknife. It's the worst thing you can do. It will lock up your wheels and guarantee that you'll lose control completely. But something about the urgency in that woman's expression, the clarity of that one word, made me stomp on the brake pedal with everything I had. The rig's air brakes locked up with a hiss that sounded like a giant serpent, and I felt the trailer whip around even more violently. We slid sideways across both lanes of the highway, completely out of control, heading for the guardrail and the steep embankment beyond it. But then, impossibly, we stopped. Not gradually, not with the grinding, scraping sound you'd expect from a jackknifed truck sliding across pavement, but suddenly and completely, as if we'd hit an invisible wall. One moment we were sliding out of control at 40 miles an hour, and the next we were sitting still. Engines still running, air brakes still locked, the trailer at about a 90-degree angle to the tractor. I sat there for a moment, hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Then I looked in my mirror again. The faces were gone. The mirror showed exactly what it should have shown. The side of my trailer, the highway behind me, the normal view you'd expect from a truck's side mirror. I released the air brakes and carefully climbed out of the cab to assess the damage. What I found made no sense at all. Despite the violent jackknife and the feeling that we'd slid across the pavement for several hundred feet, my rig was sitting perfectly positioned on the shoulder of the highway. The trailer was straight behind the tractor, the landing gear was down and stable, and there wasn't a mark on either vehicle. Even the mud flaps weren't dirty. More impossibly, I was parked in what appeared to be a designated truck breakdown area, a paved shoulder that was wider than normal, with reflective markers and even a call box for emergency assistance. But I knew for a fact that there hadn't been any such area when I'd entered the curve. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and I would have remembered a truck breakdown lane in that location. I walked around the entire rig twice, checking every tire, every mud flap, every piece of equipment. There was absolutely no sign that we'd been in an accident. The electronics load was secure and undamaged. Even my coffee cup, which I'd been sure would have flown across the cab during the jackknife, was sitting exactly where I'd left it in the cup holder. But the strangest thing was the call box. It was one of those blue emergency phones you sometimes see on highways, connected directly to state police dispatch. These boxes were common in the 1980s and 1990s, but most had been removed as cell phone coverage improved. This one looked old but well-maintained, and when I picked up the handset out of curiosity, I got a dial tone immediately. I didn't call anyone. What would I have said? That I'd had a jackknife accident that somehow left no trace, in a breakdown area that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier, while seeing faces of dead people in my mirrors. Instead, I did a final safety check of my rig and got back on the road. But as I was pulling away from that impossible breakdown area, I looked in my rearview mirror one last time and saw something that confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. There was a small historical marker on the side of the road, the kind that states put up to commemorate significant events. I couldn't read all of it from that distance, but I could make out the words traffic fatalities in 1982 to 2003. The next morning, after I'd made my delivery and had some time to think clearly about what had happened, I drove back to that section of I-23. In daylight, it looked like a perfectly normal highway curve. There was no breakdown area where I'd stopped, no call box, no historical marker, just a standard guardrail and the kind of steep embankment that would be very bad news for any truck that went over it. But I did some research when I got home. Online newspaper archives, Ohio Department of Transportation records, even some old truck driver forums where people sometimes shared stories about dangerous stretches of highway. What I found gave me chills. Between 1982 and 2003, there had been 17 fatal truck accidents on that curve. 17 different drivers, all experienced professionals, all driving in good conditions, all losing control for no apparent mechanical reason. The accidents had stopped after 2003 when the state had installed some new safety barriers and improved the curve's banking slightly. I found photos of some of the victims in old newspaper stories about the accidents. The woman in the business suit who had told me to brake, her name was Linda Thompson, and she died there in 1995 when her rig jackknifed and went over the embankment. The teenager in the varsity jacket was Michael Santos, 18 years old, driving his father's truck in 1998 when he lost control in the same spot. One by one, I matched the faces I'd seen in my mirror to newspaper photos of drivers who had died on Devil's Curve. 17 faces, 17 people who had experienced the same inexplicable loss of control that I had, but who hadn't been warned to brake at the right moment. I never reported the incident to my company. How could I? The rig was undamaged, the load was delivered on time, and I had no proof that anything unusual had happened. But I did start asking other drivers about their experiences on that stretch of highway. What I learned was that the accidents had indeed stopped after 2003, but the strange experiences hadn't. Dozens of drivers reported feeling their rigs start to slide on that curve for no reason, only to regain control at the last moment. Some mentioned seeing things in their mirrors, usually just glimpses, just enough to make them think they were seeing things. A few admitted to hearing voices over their CB radios on that stretch, voices that seemed to be giving driving advice or warnings about road conditions. One driver, a woman named Carol who'd been running that route for 15 years, told me something that made my skin crawl. She said she'd always felt like there were guardian angels watching over that curve, and that any driver who paid attention to their warnings would make it through safely. But you have to listen, she said. The ones who ignore the signs, who think they know better than the voices, those are the ones who get in trouble. I've driven that curve probably 30 times since that night, and each time I feel a little chill as I approach it. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement in my mirrors just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Sometimes I hear what might be voices on the CB so faint they could be atmospheric interference or my imagination. But I always slow down a little extra when I hit Devil's Curve, and I always listen carefully to any advice I might hear. Because I know now that some highway accidents are caused by more than just bad road conditions or driver error. Sometimes they're caused by the kind of forces that don't show up in accident reports or insurance investigations. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those same forces will reach out to save you from becoming another statistic on a stretch of road that's seen too much tragedy already. 17 drivers lost their lives on that curve, but maybe, just maybe, their spirits are still there, still trying to help other drivers avoid the same fate. I don't know if that makes me sound crazy or superstitious. I don't really care. All I know is that when I heard that voice telling me to brake, when I saw the terror and urgency in those faces in my mirror, I listened. And I'm still alive to tell this story because of it. The Devil's Curve is still there, still claiming its share of fender benders and close calls. But the fatal accident stopped 20 years ago. Right around the time drivers started reporting strange experiences and mysterious warnings. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Or maybe 17 spirits decided that enough was enough and they were going to do whatever they could to make sure no one else died the way they did. Maybe they're still out there watching over that curve, ready to grab the wheel or whisper a warning to any driver who's willing to listen. I choose to believe the latter. And every time I drive that route, I whisper a quiet thank you to Linda Thompson and Michael Santos and the 15 other drivers whose faces I saw that night. Because sometimes the best guardian angels are the ones who know exactly what you're going through. My name is Robert Bear McKinnon, and for 12 years I ran convoy with two of the best drivers I ever knew, Tom Bradley and Lisa Chen. We called ourselves the Iron Triangle, and we had a reputation for being reliable, professional, and always looking out for each other on the road. We ran the same routes, hauled the same types of loads, and never had a serious incident in all our years together. Tom was our lead driver. Lisa ran sweep, and I held the middle position. We had our system down to a science. The night everything went wrong was a Friday in late September. We were hauling 3 identical loads of automotive parts from a plant outside Detroit down to a distribution center in Nashville. Standard run for us. We'd done it probably 40 times before. The loads were valuable but not unusual. The weather was clear and traffic was light for a Friday night. We should have been in Nashville by Saturday afternoon with no problems. We left Detroit right on schedule at 9 p.m. with Tom leading in his red Peterbilt, me following in my blue Kenworth, and Lisa bringing up the rear in her white Freightliner. Our CB radios were set to channel 17, and we maintained constant communication just like we always did. Tom would call out traffic conditions, speed traps, and road hazards. I'd relay the information to Lisa and confirm our position. Lisa would watch our backs and let us know about any vehicles approaching from behind. Everything was routine until we hit the outskirts of Akron around 11:30 p.m. We were traveling south on I-77, approaching the interchange where it meets I-76. It's a complicated stretch of highway with multiple overpasses, entrance ramps, and exit ramps all clustered together. The road curves and rises and falls as it works through the interchange, and there are concrete barriers on both sides that block your view of the surrounding area. Even in daylight, it's the kind of place where you need to pay attention to the signage to make sure you don't miss your exit. At night, with just the highway lighting and your headlights to guide you, it can be confusing even for experienced drivers. But we'd been through there many times, and Tom was calling out each landmark as we approached it. Coming up on the 76 West split, Tom's voice crackled over the CB. Staying in the right lanes for 77 South. Bear, you copy? Copy that, lead dog, I responded. I got you in sight about 300 yards back. Lisa, how's it look behind us? All clear back here, Lisa's voice came through. Light traffic, no one pushing us, smooth sailing. This was our standard communication pattern, the same exchanges we'd had thousands of times before. Tom would announce what he was seeing, I'd confirm I had him in sight, and Lisa would report on conditions behind us. Simple, professional, effective. Tom's rig disappeared between two overpasses. I need to be clear about the geography here because it's important to understanding how impossible what happened next really was. The section of highway where Tom vanished runs between two concrete overpasses that are maybe 300 feet apart. There are no exit ramps between those overpasses, no entrance ramps, no side roads, no gaps in the concrete barriers, nothing. It's just a straight stretch of 4-lane highway with concrete walls on both sides and concrete bridges above. I saw Tom's taillights enter the space between the first overpass and the second overpass. I followed him through, maintaining our usual following distance. When I emerged from under the second overpass, Tom was gone. Not pulled over to the side, not broken down, not taking an exit that I'd missed, gone. His rig was simply nowhere to be seen on the highway ahead of me. Lead dog, this is Bear, I called on the CB. I don't have you in sight anymore. What's your position? No response. Tom, you copy? Where are you? Still nothing. I started to panic a little, thinking maybe he'd had a sudden mechanical failure and pulled off somewhere that I couldn't see. But as I continued down the highway, scanning both sides of the road, and all the mirrors, there was no sign of his red Peterbilt anywhere. Lisa, this is Bear, I called to our sweep driver. Do you have visual on lead dog? Negative, Lisa's voice came back immediately. I lost sight of him when he went under that second bridge. I thought you had him. I did have him, but he's not there anymore. I'm looking at empty highway. We were both professional drivers with years of experience, and we both understood that trucks don't just vanish. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Tom had taken an exit that we'd missed in the confusion of the interchange. Maybe he'd had to make a sudden lane change and was now far ahead of us. Maybe there was a communication problem with his CB radio. But as we continued south on I-77, Lisa and I maintained radio contact while scanning the highway ahead and behind us for any sign of Tom's rig. We checked every rest area, every truck stop, every place he might have pulled over. We tried reaching him on his cell phone. We even switched to different CB channels in case there was interference on 17. Nothing. After 30 minutes of searching, I suggested that Lisa and I pull over at the next truck stop to regroup and figure out what to do next. We found a Love's Travel stop about 10 miles south of where Tom had disappeared, and I parked my rig while Lisa pulled in beside me. We met in the restaurant, both of us shaken and confused. Lisa is usually the calm one in our group, the voice of reason who keeps Tom and me from getting too worked up about things. But that night, she looked as rattled as I felt. "This doesn't make sense," she said as we sat down with cups of coffee. "I've been watching you guys for 3 years. I know every move you make, every signal you give. Tom didn't exit anywhere. He didn't change lanes. He just stopped being there." We tried to think through every possibility. Mechanical failure severe enough to force an immediate stop, but we hadn't seen any debris or sign of an accident. A medical emergency that had caused Tom to pull over somewhere we couldn't see. But we'd checked every possible stopping place within miles of where he'd disappeared. Communication equipment failure that had left him unable to respond to our radio calls, but his cell phone wasn't working either. The more we talked about it, the more impossible it seemed. Lisa pulled out her laptop and logged into the GPS tracking system that our company used to monitor all their trucks. Every rig was equipped with a transponder that reported its location to the company's dispatch center every few minutes. If Tom's truck was anywhere within a few hundred miles, the system would show his position. What we found made the situation even more bizarre. According to the GPS tracking system, Tom's truck was still moving. The little icon representing his rig was showing a position about 10 miles ahead of us on I-77, maintaining highway speed, apparently continuing toward Nashville exactly as planned. But Lisa and I had been driving that same stretch of highway for the past 30 minutes, and we both knew absolutely that there was no red Peterbilt ahead of us on the road. Maybe the GPS is malfunctioning, I suggested, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Lisa zoomed in on the map display and switched to a satellite view that showed the actual highway. Tom's rig was being shown as traveling in the right lane of I-77 south, exactly where he should have been. But more than that, the system was also showing Lisa's truck and mine, and our positions were accurate to within a few feet. "The GPS is working fine for us," Lisa said. "Why would it malfunction for just Tom's truck and malfunction in a way that makes it look like he's still driving normally?" We sat there staring at the laptop screen, watching Tom's icon move steadily south while we knew for certain that his actual truck was nowhere to be seen. Every few minutes, the icon would update with a new position, showing that he was maintaining legal highway speed and staying in his lane. I called our dispatch center and explained the situation as calmly as I could. The night dispatcher, a guy named Jerry who'd been with the company for years, initially assumed we were dealing with some kind of communication problem. "GPS shows all 3 units moving normally toward Nashville," Jerry said. "Tom's running about 15 minutes ahead of you guys, which is a little unusual for your convoy, but nothing to worry about." "Jerry, I'm telling you, Tom's truck is not on this highway," I said. "Lisa and I have been looking for him for over an hour. We've checked every rest stop, every truck stop, every place he could have pulled over. He's not here." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jerry had been dispatching trucks long enough to know that drivers don't just lose track of each other without good reason. "Okay, Bear, let me check something," Jerry said. "I'm going to try to raise Tom on the company radio." "You stay on the line." I waited while Jerry attempted to contact Tom on the company's direct frequency. After a few minutes, he came back on. "No response on company radio," Jerry said. "But here's the thing. I'm showing that his truck's communication system is functioning normally. GPS is updating, engine diagnostics are coming through, even his electronic logs are recording normally. According to every system we have, Tom is driving a perfectly functional truck down I-77 toward Nashville." "But he's not there," I insisted. "I believe you," Jerry said, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "I'm going to contact Ohio State Police and ask them to keep an eye out for Tom's rig. In the meantime, you and Lisa continue toward Nashville. Maybe he had some kind of emergency and had to deviate from the route without being able to communicate with you." Lisa and I got back on the road, but now we were both seriously worried. Tom Bradley was the most reliable driver either of us had ever worked with. In 3 years of running convoy, he had never failed to communicate his position, never deviated from planned routes without explanation, never caused us to worry about his safety or whereabouts. As we continued south, we kept monitoring the GPS tracking system on Lisa's laptop. Tom's icon continued to move ahead of us, maintaining perfect highway speed, staying in the appropriate lanes, apparently making normal progress toward our destination. But the highway ahead remained empty of any red Peterbilt. Around 2 a.m., we passed a way station that was closed for the night. Lisa had an idea. "What if we call the way station and ask if they have any record of Tom passing through?" she suggested. "Most way stations have automated systems that scan every truck's DOT numbers and wait as they pass by, even when the station is closed. If Tom had passed this location, there would be a record of it." I called the number posted on the way station sign and got transferred to a state transportation office that monitored the automated systems. The technician I spoke with was helpful and agreed to check their records for Tom's truck number. "Yeah, I show that truck passing the way station at 1:47 a.m., the technician said. "Within legal weight limits, no violations, everything normal." But Lisa and I had passed that same way station at 1:52 a.m. just 5 minutes later. If Tom had really passed through at 1:47, we should have caught up with him or at least seen his taillights in the distance. "This is getting really scary," Lisa said as we sat in my cab trying to make sense of the situation. Either Tom is somehow invisible to us but visible to every electronic system, or what? Or we're dealing with something that doesn't make sense in any normal way. We decided to push on to Nashville and hope that Tom would be there when we arrived for our scheduled delivery. Maybe there was some explanation that would only become clear when we had all the facts. But as we drove through the early morning hours, something even stranger began to happen. We started getting CB radio chatter that seemed to be coming from Tom. It wasn't on our usual Channel 17. We would have heard it there. But as Lisa scanned through the CB frequencies, she occasionally picked up what sounded like Tom's voice giving standard convoy communications. "Lead dog to convoy approaching construction zone, reduce speed to 55. Lead dog to sweep. Got a four-wheeler tailgating you. Be aware. Lead dog to bear. Smoky at the 425-mile marker, eastbound side." These were exactly the kinds of communications Tom would normally make, delivered in his distinctive voice and using his usual CB terminology. But when we looked ahead, there was no construction zone, no police activity, and Lisa didn't have anyone tailgating her. More unsettling was that the mile markers Tom was calling out didn't match our current location. He was reporting mile markers that were about 20 miles ahead of where we were, as if he was driving the same route but in a different place or time. "Tom, this is Bear. Do you copy?" I called on Channel 17. The response came back on a different frequency, and Lisa had to scan to pick it up. "Copy that, Bear. Maintaining 65, all systems normal. ETA Nashville 0800 hours. Tom, we can't see you," I transmitted. "What's your exact position?" No response to that question, but a few minutes later we heard, "Lead dog to convoy, approaching rest area, continuing past, no stops planned." We were indeed approaching a rest area, but there was no red Peterbilt ahead of us to continue past it. This pattern continued for the next 3 hours. We would receive periodic CB transmissions that seemed to be coming from Tom, always on different frequencies, always reporting conditions and locations that were accurate but ahead of our position. It was as if he was driving the same route we were, but somehow separated from us by distance or time or something else entirely. The GPS tracking system continued to show Tom making normal progress toward Nashville. The company's engine monitoring system showed his truck running smoothly with normal fuel consumption, engine temperature, and all other diagnostics in the green. His electronic logbook was recording driving time exactly as it should. By every measure available to us, Tom Bradley was driving his truck normally down I-77 toward Nashville, staying in communication with his convoy and making good time toward the scheduled delivery. Except that he wasn't there. Lisa and I arrived in Nashville at 7:30 a.m., both of us exhausted and shaken by the night's events. We went immediately to the distribution center where we were supposed to make our deliveries, hoping against hope that we would find Tom's red Peterbilt in the parking lot. It wasn't there. But according to the GPS system, Tom's truck was showing as being at the delivery location. The icon on the map showed his rig parked exactly where it should be for unloading. The company's system showed that he had arrived on schedule and was preparing for delivery. Lisa and I walked through the entire parking lot twice, checking every red truck, every Peterbilt, every vehicle that could possibly be mistaken for Tom's rig. We asked the dock workers if they'd seen a red Peterbilt with Tom's truck number. We checked with security to see if there were any trucks parked in areas we couldn't see. Nothing. The receiving manager at the distribution center confirmed that they were expecting 3 trucks from our company. 2 had arrived, but the third was nowhere to be found. But when he checked his computer system, it showed all 3 trucks as being on the property and ready for unloading. "This is impossible," the receiving manager said. "My system shows your truck," he pointed at the computer screen showing Tom's truck number, "as being parked in Dock Bay 7, but Dock Bay 7 is empty." We all walked out to Dock Bay 7 together. It was indeed empty, just an empty parking space with no truck in sight. But the distribution center's automated check-in system, which uses sensors to detect when trucks are positioned at loading docks, was showing Bay 7 as occupied. I called Jerry at dispatch again and explained what we'd found. By now, word of the situation had reached the company's management, and I found myself talking to the fleet manager and eventually the owner of the company. "We're sending a security team to your location," the fleet manager told me. "This has to be some kind of equipment malfunction or computer glitch. Trucks don't just disappear." But while we waited for the security team, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Lisa was standing at the edge of the parking lot, scanning the area one more time for any sign of Tom's truck. Suddenly, she called out to me, "Bear, come here, look at this." She was staring at a section of asphalt near Dock Bay 7. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then she pointed at the ground. There were tire tracks in the asphalt. Fresh tire tracks that matched the tread pattern of the tires on Tom's truck. But more than that, the tracks showed the exact positioning that would be expected if a truck had backed up to Dock Bay 7. The tracks were so fresh that you could smell the rubber. They were deep enough to show that they'd been made by a fully loaded truck. And they led directly to the loading dock where every computer system said Tom's truck was parked. But there was no truck there. The security team arrived an hour later and conducted a thorough investigation. They found the same tire tracks Lisa had discovered, and their tread analysis confirmed that they matched the tires on Tom's missing rig. They also found that the loading dock's pressure sensors showed the weight that would be expected from a fully loaded truck, even though the dock was visibly empty. More disturbing was what they found when they checked the distribution center's security cameras. The cameras showed Lisa and me walking around the parking lot, showed the receiving manager checking Dock Bay 7, showed all the normal activity you'd expect at a trucking facility. But in several frames, the cameras also showed what appeared to be a red Peterbilt parked at Dock Bay 7. Not in every frame, just occasionally, as if the truck was flickering in and out of existence. In some frames, the dock was empty. In others, there was clearly a truck there. And in a few frames, you could see what looked like a driver climbing out of the cab. The driver in those few clear frames looked exactly like Tom Bradley. The company hired a private investigation firm to look into Tom's disappearance. They interviewed Lisa and me extensively, reviewed all the electronic records, and conducted their own analysis of the GPS and communication data. Their final report concluded that Tom Bradley and his truck had simply vanished somewhere near Akron, Ohio, at approximately 11:30 p.m. on a Friday night in September. All electronic systems continued to function normally for approximately 8 hours after the disappearance, showing the truck completing its journey to Nashville and arriving at the delivery location on schedule. But no physical trace of Tom or his truck was ever found. The investigation did turn up one interesting piece of information. They discovered that there had been 3 other similar disappearances on that same stretch of I-77 near Akron over the past 15 years. All were single trucks traveling alone at night, all vanished between the same 2 overpasses where Tom had disappeared, and all had left behind the same kind of electronic evidence. GPS system showing continued movement, but no physical presence. The previous disappearances had been attributed to various causes: drivers abandoning their trucks due to personal problems, trucks being stolen by sophisticated thieves who could defeat electronic tracking systems or simply record keeping errors that made it appear trucks had vanished when they'd actually been involved in accidents or breakdowns that weren't properly reported. But the investigators found no evidence that any of these explanations applied to Tom's case. He had no personal or financial problems that would cause him to abandon his truck. The truck and its load were worth less than what would be needed to justify the sophisticated equipment required to defeat modern tracking systems. And there was no record of any accident or breakdown involving a truck matching Tom's description. Lisa and I eventually had to accept that we would probably never know what happened to Tom Bradley that night. The company assigned us a new lead driver, and we continued running convoy routes for another 2 years. But it was never the same. Every time we passed through that section of I-77 near Akron, we would both get quiet and watch our mirrors carefully, half expecting to see Tom's red Peterbilt appear behind us. I eventually left long-haul trucking and took a local job driving for a construction company. Lisa moved to a different trucking company and started running solo. Neither of us could handle the constant reminder of that night when our partner just disappeared between 2 overpasses on a stretch of highway that should have been perfectly safe and normal. But sometimes late at night when I'm driving through Ohio on some job, I'll scan through the CB channels and listen for familiar voices. And once in a while I'll hear something that sounds like Tom Bradley giving convoy communications to drivers who can't see him. Lead dog to convoy, construction ahead, reduce speed. Lead dog to bear, you copy. Lead dog to sweep, watch your 6. I don't respond to those transmissions anymore. I learned my lesson about trying to communicate with voices that come from trucks you can't see. But I always slow down when I hear them, and I always check my mirrors more carefully because I think maybe Tom is still out there somewhere, still running lead for convoys that exist in a place where GPS works but eyes don't, where trucks leave tire tracks but cast no shadows. The Iron Triangle became just 2 points that night near Akron, and sometimes I think the missing point is still out there, still trying to guide the rest of us safely down the highway, still calling out warnings and advice to anyone who knows how to listen for a voice that comes from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'm Tom Williams, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me and my son Jake 3 years ago on a stretch of highway that most truckers know to avoid after dark. We were running a father-son team operation, which was something I'd always dreamed of doing. Jake had just turned 21 and gotten his CDL, and I'd convinced him to join me on the road instead of going to college right away. Looking back, maybe I should have encouraged him to stick with his original plan to study engineering, but at the time I was proud to have him as my co-driver. We were hauling a load of farm equipment from Illinois down to Georgia, running through Ohio on Route 52 along the Ohio River. It's a beautiful drive during the day. Scenic views of the river, rolling hills, and small towns that look like they haven't changed much since the 1950s. But at night, especially the section that runs through what the locals call Dead Man's Hollow, it becomes a different place entirely. Dead Man's Hollow isn't an official name. You won't find it on any road signs or maps. But every trucker who runs Route 52 regularly knows exactly which stretch of highway I'm talking about. It's a low-lying area where the road dips down between 2 hills, following the path of a small creek that eventually flows into the Ohio River. The hollow is maybe 5 miles long, and during that entire stretch your cell phone doesn't work, your GPS gets confused, and your CB radio picks up nothing but static. Or at least, that's what it usually picks up. Jake and I had driven through Dead Man's Hollow probably a dozen times over the 6 months he'd been driving with me, always during daylight hours. We knew about the communication dead zone, and we'd always just treated it as one of those quirks of rural highway driving. Some places just don't get good signal coverage, especially in valleys and hollows where the terrain blocks radio waves. But this particular night was the first time we'd hit that section after dark. It was around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. We'd been making good time from Illinois, and I'd decided to push through to Georgia rather than stop for our mandatory rest break. Jake was driving while I caught a few hours of sleep in the bunk, which was our usual arrangement for night driving. He was a good driver, cautious, attentive, and always followed the safety protocols I'd taught him. I woke up when I felt the truck starting to slow down and descend into what I knew had to be Dead Man's Hollow. Jake was being extra careful because of the curves and the steep grades, which was exactly what he should have been doing. "How's it going up there?" I called from the bunk. "Good, Dad. Just coming into that dead zone you told me about. Signal's already getting weak." I climbed up into the passenger seat to keep him company through the hollow. It's a lonely stretch of road under the best circumstances, and I knew Jake would appreciate having someone to talk to while we navigated the winding descent. As we dropped down into the hollow, our CB radio began producing the familiar static we'd experienced during our daytime trips through the area. But this time, the static seemed different somehow. Instead of the random white noise you'd normally expect from a dead radio signal, this sounded almost like voices buried deep in the interference. "Dad, are you hearing that?" Jake asked, turning down the volume on our stereo so we could listen more carefully to the CB. I adjusted the squelch and scanned through the channels, trying to find a clear frequency. Every channel was producing the same strange static, not random noise, but what sounded like multiple conversations happening at the same time, all buried under layers of interference that made it impossible to understand what was being said. "Probably just atmospheric interference," I told Jake, though I'd never heard anything quite like it before. Sometimes weather patterns can make radio signals bounce in weird ways. But as we continued deeper into the hollow, the voices in the static became clearer. Not clear enough to understand words, but clear enough to recognize that we were definitely hearing human voices. Multiple people talking at the same time, all using the distinctive rhythm and terminology of CB radio communication. "Breaker 19. This is eastbound, Eddie. Anybody got your ears on?" "That's a big 10-4, good buddy. What's your 20? "Smoky report, westbound at the 47 running radar. Watch out for that four-wheeler in the hammer lane running about 90 and weaving." The voices were faint and distorted, but they were definitely CB radio chatter. The strange thing was that the language and slang the voices were using sounded old-fashioned, like CB talk from the 1970s and 1980s. Modern truckers still use CB radios, but the elaborate codes and colorful terminology that was popular during the CB radio craze of the late 70s had largely died out. "Dad, that's weird," Jake said. "Those guys are using CB slang I've only heard in old movies." I had to agree. Terms like good buddy and smoky and references to hammer lanes and four-wheelers were classic trucker talk from decades ago. Modern CB communication tends to be more straightforward and less colorful. As we reached the bottom of the hollow, the voices suddenly became much clearer, as if we'd driven into the range of a powerful CB repeater. But the conversations we were hearing made no sense for our current location and time. "Eastbound convoy, you got a smoky at the way station, mile marker 23 running full inspection." Jake and I looked at each other. There was no way station at mile marker 23 on Route 52. We'd driven this route many times, and we knew every way station, rest area, and truck stop along the way. "Bear in the air. Eastbound at the 31, you got construction ahead, single lane for about 2 miles. Again, there was no construction on Route 52. We'd checked road conditions before starting our trip, and the highway was clear all the way to Georgia. But the most unsettling thing about the voices was that they seemed to be describing our exact location, but with details that didn't match what we could see outside our windows. Eastbound big truck, red tractor with white trailer. You got a tire problem on your trailer tandems, might want to check it out. Jake and I were driving a red tractor pulling a white trailer. Red big truck eastbound, this is westbound Willie, I'm flashing my lights at you, you got smoke coming from your trailer brakes. Jake immediately checked his mirrors and gauges. Our trailer brakes were functioning normally, temperatures were in the normal range, and there was no smoke visible behind us. But as he was checking, we saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A westbound truck whose driver flashed his lights at us as he passed. "Did you see a truck back there?" I asked Jake. "I saw headlights, but I couldn't make out the truck." "Why?" I was starting to feel seriously unsettled. The voices on the CB were describing specific details about our truck and our location, but the information they were giving didn't match what we could actually observe. It was as if they were seeing us, but seeing us in a different place or time. "Dad, listen to this," Jake said, turning up the CB volume. "Red eastbound, you got a problem ahead, jackknife truck blocking both lanes at mile marker 38. Emergency vehicles on scene, traffic backed up about 3 miles. We were approaching mile marker 38, and Jake began slowing down in anticipation of the accident the voices were describing. But as we crested a small hill and got a clear view of the highway ahead, there was no accident, no emergency vehicles, and no backed-up traffic. The road was completely clear. Red eastbound, do you copy?" Without thinking, I picked up the CB microphone and responded. "This is red eastbound, I copy you." The response came back immediately. "Red eastbound, you need to get off the highway right now. Exit at mile marker 39, truck stop on the right. Do not continue east on 52 inches. "Why?" "What's the problem?" "Bridge is out at mile marker 43. Truck went through the guardrail about an hour. Ego roads closed. Emergency vehicles still on scene." Jake and I looked at each other with growing alarm. Mile marker 39 was coming up in about 2 miles, and there was indeed a truck stop at that location. But we'd driven this route recently enough to know that the bridge at mile marker 43 was intact and had no recent damage. "Dad, what do you think?" Jake asked. "These guys seem to know details about our truck and our location, but everything they're telling us is wrong." I was torn between trusting the voices that seemed to be looking out for our safety and believing what we could see with our own eyes. The voices were giving us specific, detailed warnings about road hazards, but none of the hazards they were describing actually existed. "Red eastbound, this is your final warning. Exit at 39 or you're going to end up in the river." The urgency in the voice was unmistakable. Whoever was transmitting wasn't just giving casual advice. They were genuinely afraid for our safety. "Take the exit," I told Jake. "Better safe than sorry." Jake took the exit at mile marker 39 and we pulled into the truck stop the voices had directed us to. As soon as we parked, the CB radio went silent. Not static, just complete silence. The truck stop was one of those older independent places that hasn't been updated in decades. The building looked like it dated from the 1970s with faded signs advertising brands of motor oil and tires that I hadn't seen in years. But it was clean and well-maintained, and the parking lot was about half full of trucks. Jake and I went inside to get coffee and try to make sense of what had just happened. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd been working at truck stops her entire life. "Evening, drivers," she said as we walked in. "Y'all look a little shaken up. Everything okay?" "We just had a strange experience on the CB radio," I said. "Voices telling us about road hazards that don't seem to exist." The woman's expression grew serious. You were driving through the hollow, weren't you? Dead Man's Hollow, yes. How did you know? Because you're not the first drivers to come in here with that story. Happens maybe once or twice a month, usually to folks who are driving through the hollow for the first time at night. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them in front of us. The voices you heard, did they sound like they were using old-fashioned CB talk? Lots of Good Buddy and Smokey Bear and that kind of thing. Jake and I nodded. Those are the voices of truckers who died in accidents on Route 52, the clerk said matter-of-factly. Been happening for about 20 years now, ever since they put in that new bridge at mile marker 43. New bridge? I asked. That bridge looks like it's been there for decades. It has been there for decades now, but it replaced an older bridge that collapsed in 1987. Took a truck driver with it. Fellow named Eddie Morrison ran under. The handle Eastbound Eddie. He was coming through the hollow late at night just like you guys when the old bridge gave way. Truck went right into the creek. I felt a chill run down my spine. Eastbound Eddie, that was one of the handles we'd heard on the CB. After they built the new bridge, the clerk continued, drivers started reporting voices on the CB in the hollow. Always the same pattern, warnings about road hazards, advice about where to stop, directions to get off the highway before reaching the bridge. And the strange thing is, drivers who follow the advice never have accidents. Drivers who ignore the voices. She trailed off, shaking her head. What happens to drivers who ignore the voices? Jake asked. Over the past 20 years, there have been maybe a dozen serious accidents right around mile marker 43. Usually single trucks, usually late at night, usually drivers who were traveling through the hollow for the first time. The investigating officers always said the accidents were unexplained. Good weather, experienced drivers, well-maintained trucks, but something caused them to lose control right at that bridge. The clerk walked over to a bulletin board near the cash register and pointed to a newspaper clipping from several years earlier. The headline read, "Truck driver dies in Highway 52 accident," and the story described a nighttime crash where a truck had gone through the guardrail at mile marker 43 and ended up in the creek below. The driver who died in that accident, the clerk said, had stopped here about an hour before the crash. He told me he'd been hearing voices on his CB giving him warnings about road hazards. Said the voices were trying to get him to stop, but he was behind schedule and needed to push through. Jake and I spent another hour at that truck stop talking to other drivers and hearing similar stories. It seemed that the phenomenon of voices in Dead Man's Hollow was well known among truckers who ran Route 52 regularly. Most drivers who'd experienced it had followed the advice of the voices and avoided problems. The few who hadn't. Well, according to the local newspaper clippings posted on the truck stop's bulletin board, there had been an unusually high number of single-vehicle accidents on that stretch of highway over the past 2 decades. We stayed at the truck stop until dawn, then continued our journey to Georgia. In daylight, the drive through Dead Man's Hollow was completely normal. No CB voices, no warnings, just a quiet stretch of rural highway following a creek through a valley. But at mile marker 43, we both noticed something that made our blood run cold. The bridge that crossed the creek at that point was indeed a newer structure, but you could see the old concrete supports from the previous bridge still standing in the creek below. And wrapped around one of those old supports was what looked like the rusted remains of a truck chassis. Jake and I made several more trips through Ohio over the next year, but we always arranged our schedules to hit Route 52 during daylight hours. We never drove through Dead Man's Hollow at night again, but I did some research on the accidents that had occurred in that area. What I found convinced me that the voices Jake and I had heard weren't just atmospheric interference or our imagination. Eddie Morrison, the driver who died when the original bridge collapsed in 1987, had indeed used the CB handle Eastbound Eddie. The newspaper accounts of his accident described him as a veteran driver who was known for helping other truckers by reporting road hazards and giving advice over the CB radio. The other drivers whose voices we'd heard, Westbound Willie, Bear in the Air, and several others, were all handles used by drivers who had died in accidents on Route 52 over the years since the new bridge was built. It seemed that they were still out there, still watching the highway, still trying to keep other drivers safe by warning them about hazards that only they could see. Maybe they were seeing the road as it existed in their own time when the old bridge was still standing and ready to collapse. Or maybe they were seeing something else entirely, some kind of spiritual hazard that living drivers couldn't perceive, but that was just as dangerous as any physical obstacle. I don't know the answer to those questions, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that when experienced truck drivers start hearing voices on their CB radios warning them about dangers ahead, it's probably wise to listen. Jake eventually decided that trucking wasn't for him and went back to school to study engineering, just like he'd originally planned. He never said it was because of what happened that night in Dead Man's Hollow, but I could tell the experience had shaken him. He's doing well now, got his degree, works for a construction company designing bridges, ironically enough. As for me, I kept driving for another 2 years before I finally retired. But I never forgot the lesson I learned that night about listening to voices that come from places you can't see, about trusting warnings that come from drivers who may have learned their lessons the hard way. And sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas late at night and the CB starts picking up strange static, I turn up the volume and listen carefully. Because you never know when you might hear the voice of someone who's trying to save you from making the same mistake they made. The highway can be a dangerous place, especially late at night when you're tired and your guard is down. But sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can hear the voices of drivers who've gone before, still out there trying to guide the living safely through the darkness. I think that's a kind of immortality worth believing in. My name is Carlos Rodriguez, and I've been driving truck for 8 years now. I started right after high school when my uncle got me a job with the company he worked for, and I've been on the road ever since. I've hauled everything from auto parts to furniture to hazardous materials, and I've driven just about every major highway in the eastern United States. But I'd never run a route through Ohio until the night I encountered something that changed the way I think about what's possible on America's highways. It was early December, and I was driving a load of electronics from a warehouse in Pennsylvania to a distribution center in St. Louis. The company had assigned me a route that took me west on I-70, then south on various state highways to avoid some construction delays on the interstate. It wasn't a route I was familiar with, but the GPS directions seemed straightforward enough and the weather was clear despite the cold. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I hit the section of Route 40 that runs through eastern Ohio. It's a lonesome stretch of 2-lane highway that passes through small farming communities and patches of forest with very little traffic after midnight. The kind of road where you might see another vehicle every 10 or 15 minutes, and where most of the businesses are closed up tight by 9 p.m. I was making good time and feeling alert, listening to talk radio and occasionally checking in with other drivers on the CB. The load I was hauling was valuable but not particularly heavy, and my truck was running smoothly. Everything was routine until I spotted the fire ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing the lights of an emergency scene, maybe an accident with ambulances and fire trucks responding. There was a bright orange glow visible through the trees about a mile ahead, the kind of intense light that comes from burning gasoline or diesel fuel. But as I got closer, I realized there were no emergency vehicles, no flashing lights, no signs of an organized response to whatever was burning. When I crested a small hill and got a clear view of what was ahead, I saw a semi-truck engulfed in flames on the shoulder of the highway. It was a devastating fire, the kind that completely destroys a truck and trailer in a matter of minutes. Flames were shooting 20 feet into the air, and I could see the outline of the cab and trailer being consumed by the blaze. The heat was so intense that I could feel it through my windshield even though I was still several hundred yards away. I immediately grabbed my CB microphone and tried to raise someone to report the fire. "Mayday, mayday, this is eastbound on Route 40. I've got a truck fire at..." I looked at my GPS to get the mile marker. Approximately mile marker 73. Need emergency response immediately. No response on the CB. I tried several channels, but all I got was static. I pulled out my cell phone to call 911, but I had no signal. That wasn't unusual for this stretch of rural highway, but it meant I couldn't immediately report the fire to emergency services. My first thought was that I needed to get to the burning truck as quickly as possible to see if I could help the driver. Truck fires can develop very quickly, and if someone was trapped in that cab, every second counted. I accelerated toward the scene, already planning how I would approach the burning rig and what I could do to assist. But as I got closer, I began to notice details that didn't make sense. The truck that was burning appeared to be much older than any commercial vehicle that should have been on the road. The cab design looked like something from the 1960s, a long-nosed Peterbilt or Kenworth with the kind of classic styling that you only see at antique truck shows nowadays. The trailer also looked old-fashioned, with the kind of simple rectangular design that was common decades ago. More puzzling was that despite the intensity of the fire, the truck didn't seem to be burning up. The flames were enormous and obviously real. I could feel the heat, smell the burning fuel and rubber, and see the smoke rising into the night sky. But the actual structure of the truck and trailer remained intact, as if the fire was consuming fuel and producing heat and light without actually destroying the metal and other materials. I pulled over about 100 yards away from the burning truck, grabbed my fire extinguisher, and ran toward the scene. As I got closer, I could see that there was indeed someone in the driver's seat of the burning cab. The figure appeared to be a man, but he wasn't moving, wasn't trying to escape from the flames that were surrounding him. He was just sitting there, hands on the steering wheel, as if he was still trying to drive even though his truck was completely engulfed in fire. "Hey!" I shouted as I ran toward the burning cab. "Hey, you need to get out of there!" The figure turned toward me, and I got my first clear look at his face. It was a skull. Not a skull mask, not some kind of Halloween decoration, but an actual human skull with empty eye sockets and yellowed bone visible in the firelight. But as I stared at this impossible sight, the skull moved as if it was alive, turning to look directly at me, and then it raised one bony hand from the steering wheel. The skeleton was waving me away, gesturing for me to go back, to get away from the burning truck. I stopped running and stood there in the middle of Route 40, fire extinguisher in hand, staring at a burning truck being driven by a skeleton who was trying to warn me away from the scene. Every rational part of my mind was telling me that what I was seeing couldn't be real, that I was hallucinating or dreaming or having some kind of breakdown. But the heat from the fire was real, the smell of burning fuel was real, and the skeleton's warning gestures were becoming more urgent. That's when I heard the drunk driver coming up behind me. The sound of screeching tires and the smell of burning rubber made me turn around just in time to see a pickup truck weaving across both lanes of the highway, heading directly toward where I was standing. The driver was obviously impaired, swerving from side to side, overcorrecting each time he started to drift off the road. If I had continued running toward the burning semi, if I had been focused on trying to help what I thought was a trapped driver, I would have been standing directly in the path of that pickup truck when it came barreling through. The skeleton's warning had literally saved my life. I dove toward the ditch as the pickup truck careened past, missing me by maybe 3 feet. The drunk driver continued down the highway, apparently unaware that he'd nearly killed someone and his taillights disappeared around a curve. When I looked back toward the burning truck, it was gone. Not extinguished, not reduced to smoking wreckage, but completely gone. The shoulder of the highway where it had been was empty. No fire, no smoke, no sign that anything had ever been burning there. I walked over to the spot where the truck had been parked. The asphalt was cool to the touch with no scorch marks, no oil stains, no evidence of the intense fire I'd witnessed just moments before. Even the air no longer smelled of burning fuel. I stood there on the empty highway for several minutes trying to make sense of what had happened. I checked my mirrors and gauges to make sure I wasn't having some kind of medical emergency that might cause hallucinations. I felt my pulse, checked my blood pressure on the gauge I keep in the cab, even looked at my eyes in the mirror to see if my pupils were dilated. Everything seemed normal. I felt completely alert and healthy with no signs of fatigue or illness that might explain what I'd experienced. But I was shaken enough by the encounter that I decided to find a place to stop and rest, maybe call dispatch to let them know I was taking an unscheduled break. There was a 24-hour truck stop about 20 miles ahead according to my GPS, and I figured I could get some coffee and try to process what had happened. As I was walking back toward my rig, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were skid marks on the highway where the drunk driver's pickup truck had swerved, and those skid marks came within inches of where I would have been standing if I'd continued running toward the burning semi. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. If the skeleton hadn't warned me away from the burning truck, if I hadn't stopped and turned around at exactly the right moment, I would have been killed by a drunk driver who probably never even knew I was there. I drove to the truck stop in a daze, still trying to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation for what I'd experienced. Maybe the burning truck had been real and it had driven away while I was distracted by the near miss with the pickup. Maybe the figure I'd seen in the cab hadn't been a skeleton, but just a driver wearing some kind of reflective clothing that had created an optical illusion in the firelight. But deep down, I knew that none of those explanations made sense. I'd seen what I'd seen, and it had saved my life. The truck stop was a typical 24-hour facility. Bright lights, plenty of parking, a restaurant and convenience store that catered to drivers who needed to eat, rest, or shower at any hour of the day or night. I parked my rig and went inside, hoping that being around other people would help me feel more normal. The night clerk was a guy about my age who looked like he'd been working the overnight shift for years. He had that tired but alert expression that comes from staying awake all night on a regular basis, and he nodded when I walked in. "Evening, driver. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the accuracy of his observation. "Something like that. You ever hear any strange stories about Route 40? Specifically about truck fires?" His expression grew more serious. "You saw the burning truck, didn't you? You know about it? Every truck stop employee in this part of Ohio knows about it. Drivers come in here maybe once or twice a month with the same story. Burning semi on Route 40. Skeleton driver, truck disappears after warning them about some kind of danger." He poured me a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. First time I heard the story, I figured it was just a driver who'd been on the road too long, seeing things that weren't there. But after you hear the same story from dozens of different drivers, all describing exactly the same details, you start to think maybe there's something to it. What do you think it is? Local history says there was a fatal truck accident on that stretch of road back in 1963. Driver named Jimmy Kowalski was hauling a load of farming equipment from Pennsylvania to Missouri when his truck caught fire due to a mechanical problem. He stayed with the rig trying to put out the fire instead of getting away from it, and he died when the fuel tanks exploded. The clerk pulled out a newspaper clipping that had been laminated and mounted on the wall behind the counter. It was from a local paper dated December 1963 with a headline that read, "Trucker Dies in Highway Fire." The accompanying photo showed the burned-out remains of a semi-truck that looked very much like the one I'd encountered. According to the accident report, the clerk continued, Jimmy died trying to flag down other vehicles to warn them about a drunk driver who was driving the wrong way on the highway. The drunk driver ended up killing a family of 4 about 2 miles down the road from where Jimmy's truck burned. I felt a chill as I realized the parallel between Jimmy Kowalski's story and what had happened to me. He died trying to warn other drivers about a dangerous situation, and now his spirit seemed to be continuing that mission decades after his death. So you think Jimmy is still out there, still trying to warn drivers about road hazards? I think Jimmy Kowalski was the kind of man who looked out for other people, and death didn't change that about him. The drivers who see his truck are always in some kind of danger. Drunk drivers, mechanical problems, medical emergencies, weather hazards, and the ones who pay attention to his warning never seem to get hurt. The clerk showed me a collection of similar stories that other drivers had shared over the years. All involved seeing the burning truck at moments when they were about to encounter some kind of serious danger. Some had been warned about drunk drivers like me. Others had been alerted to mechanical problems with their own trucks, or warned about severe weather conditions that their radios hadn't picked up yet. In every case, the drivers who heeded the skeleton's warning had avoided serious accidents or injuries. What about drivers who ignore the warning? I asked. The clerk's expression grew somber. There haven't been many, but the ones who do, well, let's just say that stretch of Route 40 has had more than its share of fatal accidents over the years. Always single vehicles, always drivers who were traveling through the area for the first time. I spent another hour at that truck stop, talking to other drivers who were taking their breaks and listening to more stories about encounters with the burning truck. It seemed that Jimmy Kowalski had become something of a legend among truckers who ran routes through Ohio, a guardian spirit who watched over a dangerous stretch of highway. Some drivers claimed they'd seen him multiple times over the years, always at moments when they needed to be warned about some imminent danger. Others said they'd only seen him once, but that single encounter had saved their lives or prevented serious accidents. All agreed that drivers who encountered the burning truck should consider themselves lucky, even if the experience was terrifying at the time. I finished my coffee and got back on the road, but I drove much more cautiously for the rest of my trip to St. Louis. Every time I saw headlights in my mirrors, I wondered if they belonged to another drunk driver. Every time I felt my truck handling differently, I wondered if I was developing a mechanical problem that might lead to an accident. But I made it to my destination safely, delivered my load on time, and eventually made it back home without any further incidents. Over the next few years, I ran several more loads that took me through Ohio, but I never encountered the burning truck again. I did, however, make it a point to be extra cautious whenever I drove through that section of Route 40, especially at night, and I started paying more attention to things that seemed unusual or out of place while I was driving. Strange sounds from my engine, unusual behavior from other vehicles, weather patterns that didn't match what the forecast had predicted. I figured that if Jimmy Kowalski's spirit was looking out for truckers on Route 40, the least I could do was stay alert and watch for signs of trouble on my own. I never saw Jimmy again, but I did have a few experiences over the years where I got warnings that seemed to come from nowhere. CB radio voices advising me to check my tires just before I discovered a dangerous blowout waiting to happen, or sudden instincts to change lanes just before a drunk driver came barreling through my previous position. I don't know if those warnings came from Jimmy Kowalski or from some other source, but I always listened to them, and I always made it home safely. The trucking industry has changed a lot in the years since my encounter with the burning truck. GPS systems are more accurate, cell phone coverage is better, and trucks are equipped with more safety features than ever before. But the highways themselves are still dangerous places, especially late at night when fatigue and impaired drivers create deadly combinations. I think there's something to be said for believing that drivers who died trying to help others might still be out there, still watching over the highways they once traveled, still trying to prevent the kinds of accidents that took their own lives. Whether you call them ghosts, spirits, guardian angels, or just the power of positive thinking, I believe there are forces looking out for professional drivers who spend their lives on America's highways. Forces that will warn you about dangers ahead if you know how to listen. Jimmy Kowalski died in 1963 trying to warn other drivers about a drunk driver. 60 years later, he's still doing the same job, still trying to save lives on a stretch of highway that's seen too much tragedy already. I consider myself lucky to have encountered him, even if it was the most terrifying experience of my driving career. Because I'm alive today, and my family still has a husband and father. Because a man who died decades ago took the time to wave me away from danger. That's the kind of immortality I can believe in, not living forever but caring forever, continuing to help people long after your own life has ended. Jimmy Kowalski may be dead, but his spirit of service lives on, one warning at a time, one saved life at a time. The next time you're driving late at night and something seems unusual or out of place, pay attention. It might just be a guardian spirit trying to keep you safe on your journey home. My name is Sarah Kim, and I've been driving trucks solo for 9 years. I started as a team driver with my ex-husband, but after our divorce, I decided I preferred the solitude of running alone. There's something peaceful about being out on the highway by yourself, with nothing but the road ahead and your own thoughts for company. I've always been a night driver. I like the lighter traffic and the cooler temperatures, and I've never been bothered by the isolation that some drivers find unsettling about overnight runs. But there's one trip I made 3 years ago that changed the way I think about being alone on the highway, about who might be sharing the road with you even when you can't see them. I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina up to Cleveland, running north on I-77 through Ohio. It was a route I'd driven dozens of times, and I was making good time despite some scattered fog that had been rolling in and out all evening. The CB was quiet, with just occasional chatter from other drivers reporting on road conditions or smoky sightings. Around 2 a.m., somewhere south of Canton, I noticed headlights appear in my driver's side mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Getting passed by cars and trucks is a normal part of highway driving, especially at night when faster traffic tends to bunch up behind slower-moving trucks. I was running at 65 miles per hour, which is about as fast as I ever drive with a full load, so it made perfect sense that another vehicle would want to pass me. I moved slightly to the right to give the passing vehicle plenty of room and settled in to wait for it to go around me. But after a few minutes, the headlights were still there, maintaining the same distance behind me. I checked my speedometer to make sure I wasn't unconsciously slowing down, which sometimes happens when you're tired. I was still doing exactly 65 miles per hour. The headlights behind me were keeping pace perfectly, neither gaining nor falling back. I figured the driver was probably just being cautious, maybe waiting for a clearer stretch of highway to make the pass. I-77 through that section of Ohio has some curves and hills that can make passing challenging, especially at night. So I continued driving normally and expected the vehicle to go around me when the driver felt it was safe to do so. But after 15 minutes, the headlights were still there. Now I was starting to get a little annoyed. I don't mind being passed, but I don't like having someone tailgate me for extended periods. The headlights appeared to be maintaining a following distance of maybe 100 yards, which wasn't dangerously close, but it was close enough to be noticeable. I tried flashing my running lights to signal that it was okay to pass, thinking maybe the other driver was being overly polite and waiting for some kind of invitation. No response. The headlights continued to follow me at the same distance. I tried slowing down to 60 miles per hour, figuring that would encourage the other driver to go around me. The headlights slowed down too, maintaining the exact same following distance. I tried speeding up to 70 miles per hour for a few minutes. The headlights sped up as well, never getting closer or farther away. By this point, I was getting genuinely concerned. In 9 years of driving, I'd never encountered another driver who seemed to be deliberately matching my speed and following distance so precisely. It was starting to feel less like normal highway traffic and more like I was being deliberately followed. I grabbed my CB microphone and tried to raise the driver behind me. "Driver with the headlights following the eastbound furniture truck on 77, this is the truck you're following. You got your ears on?" No response. I tried several different channels, thinking maybe the driver was monitoring a frequency I wasn't using. "Any driver behind the eastbound big truck on 77, this is the truck in front of you. Would you like to go around?" Still no response. I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. Modern trucks and cars are equipped with all kinds of communication equipment: CB radios, cell phones, even satellite systems. For a driver to be completely unresponsive to multiple attempts at communication was highly unusual. I decided to take the next exit and see what the following vehicle would do. If it was just another trucker who happened to be going to the same destination, they'd probably continue on the interstate. If someone was actually following me deliberately, they'd probably take the exit too. The next exit was for a small town called Brewster. I signaled well in advance, moved to the exit ramp, and took the off-ramp at a normal speed. In my mirrors, I watched the headlights follow me onto the exit ramp. The exit led to a typical small-town interchange, a gas station, a fast food restaurant, and a few other businesses, most of which were closed at 2:30 a.m. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station and watched my mirrors to see what the vehicle behind me would do. The headlights pulled into the parking lot behind me and stopped about 50 yards away. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, waiting to see if the driver would get out or approach my truck or do something that would help me understand what was going on. The headlights just sat there, pointing in my direction with no signs of movement or activity. I decided to get out and walk over to the other vehicle to find out what the driver wanted. As I climbed down from my cab and started walking across the parking lot, I could see that the headlights belonged to a truck. I could make out the general shape of a cab and trailer in the glow of the gas station's security lights. But as I got closer, something seemed wrong with the proportions. The truck looked oddly elongated, as if the trailer was much longer than a standard 53-foot unit. The cab also seemed unusually tall, with a profile that didn't match any modern truck design I was familiar with. When I was about 20 feet away from the other truck, I called out, "Hey, driver! Everything okay? You've been following me for a while." No response from inside the cab. I walked closer and tried to peer through the windshield to see if there was actually someone in the driver's seat. The interior of the cab was completely dark, and I couldn't see any indication that there was a person inside. But the engine was running. I could hear the idle and see the exhaust vapor coming from the stacks. "Hello?" I called out louder this time. "Is someone in there?" That's when I noticed that I couldn't see the truck's license plate, DOT numbers, or any other identifying information. The trailer was completely unmarked, with no company logos or even basic safety reflectors. In the strange lighting of the gas station parking lot, the entire rig looked almost translucent, like it was made of some material that didn't quite interact with light the way metal and paint should. I was starting to feel genuinely frightened. I backed away from the mysterious truck and walked quickly back to my own rig, looking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. As I climbed back into my cab, I looked in my mirrors and saw that the other truck was no longer there. Not driving away, not moved to a different part of the parking lot, but simply gone. The spot where it had been parked was empty, with no sign that a vehicle had ever been there. I sat in my truck for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. I walked around the gas station parking lot twice, checking every possible location where a truck could have parked. I even went inside and asked the clerk if he'd seen another truck in the parking lot. "Just yours," he said. "Been here about 15 minutes, didn't see any other trucks tonight." I described the truck I'd seen and the clerk shook his head. "You sure you saw another truck?" Sometimes at night, shadows and reflections can play tricks on you. But I knew what I'd seen. I'd been followed by a truck for over an hour, had watched it take the same exit I'd taken, had seen it park in the same parking lot where I was parked. The truck had been real enough to cast shadows and produce engine noise and exhaust vapor. But now it was gone as if it had never existed. I got back on I-77 and continued toward Cleveland, but I was badly shaken by the experience. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the mysterious headlights reappear behind me. But the highway remained empty for the rest of the trip. I delivered my load in Cleveland the next morning and tried to put the incident out of my mind. But over the next few months, I found myself thinking about it more and more. I started asking other drivers if they'd ever experienced anything similar, being followed by vehicles that seemed to behave in impossible ways. What I discovered was that my experience wasn't unique. A surprising number of drivers, especially solo drivers running night routes, had stories about being followed by mysterious vehicles that didn't behave like normal traffic. Most of the stories followed a similar pattern. Headlights that appeared in mirrors and maintained perfect following distance for extended periods, vehicles that wouldn't respond to CB radio calls or other communication attempts, and encounters that ended with the mysterious vehicle simply disappearing. Some drivers thought these encounters were evidence of surveillance or law enforcement operations. Others believed they were seeing experimental vehicles or military convoys that used advanced technology to avoid detection. But a few drivers, usually older ones with decades of experience on the road, had a different theory. They believed that some highways were haunted by the spirits of drivers who had died in accidents, and that these spirits continued to travel their familiar routes even after death. Ghost trucks, one old-timer called them. Drivers who died doing what they loved, still out there running the same routes they always ran. I was skeptical of supernatural explanations, but I couldn't come up with any rational theory that explained what I'd experienced. The truck I'd seen had been solid enough to block the gas station's lights and cast shadows on the ground. But it had disappeared instantly and completely, leaving no trace of its presence. Over the next year, I had 2 more similar encounters on different highways. Each time, the pattern was the same. Mysterious headlights that followed me for extended distances, perfect synchronization with my speed and lane changes, complete lack of response to communication attempts, and sudden disappearance when I tried to investigate. The encounters were always unsettling, but they never felt threatening. The mysterious vehicles never tried to force me off the road or engage in aggressive driving. They just followed as if they were keeping me company on long, lonely stretches of highway. I started to think of them as guardian spirits, drivers who had passed on but who continued to watch over those of us who were still making our living on the road. Maybe they were trying to make sure I didn't fall asleep at the wheel. Or maybe they were just lonely souls who missed the camaraderie of sharing the highway with other drivers. The last encounter I had was the most dramatic. I was driving through West Virginia on I-64, hauling a load of appliances to Kentucky. It was about 3 a.m., and I was climbing a long grade in heavy fog when I realized I was having brake problems. My air pressure was dropping faster than it should have been, and I could feel the brakes starting to fade as I tried to maintain control on the steep, winding mountain highway. I was in serious trouble. If my brakes failed completely while I was on that grade, I'd end up as just another runaway truck crash statistic. That's when the headlights appeared behind me. Not following at a distance this time, but right behind me, close enough that I could see the outline of the cab in my mirrors. The mysterious truck stayed right behind me as I nursed my failing brakes down the mountain, and I got the distinct impression that if my rig started to run away, the truck behind me would try to slow me down or push me to safety. I managed to get my truck to a runaway truck ramp about halfway down the grade, and as I pulled into the emergency area, I looked in my mirrors to see what the truck behind me would do. It was gone. But on the ground where it should have been, I found something that convinced me once and for all that my mysterious followers weren't hallucinations or optical illusions. There were tire tracks in the dirt beside the runaway ramp, tracks that showed a truck had pulled over and stopped at exactly the spot where I'd last seen the headlights behind me. The tracks were fresh and deep, made by a heavily loaded truck, but they ended abruptly as if the truck had simply vanished while parked. A state trooper who responded to my brake failure call examined the tire tracks and confirmed that they'd been made by a large commercial vehicle. But he had no explanation for why the tracks ended so suddenly, or where the truck that made them could have gone. "Strangest thing I've seen in 20 years of highway patrol," he said. "Looks like a truck just disappeared into thin air." I had my brakes repaired and completed my delivery to Kentucky, but I kept thinking about those tire tracks and what they meant. Someone or something had been watching over me during one of the most dangerous situations I'd ever faced as a driver. And that someone had left physical evidence of their presence, even if I couldn't explain who they were or where they'd gone. I don't drive solo anymore. A few months after the brake incident, I started driving team with a guy named Pete, who's become a good friend and partner. We run longer routes now, cross-country loads that keep us busy and profitable. But sometimes when Pete is sleeping in the bunk and I'm driving alone through the night, I'll catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirrors that seem to be following at just the right distance. And instead of being frightened, I feel comforted. Because I know that somewhere out there on America's highways there are drivers who care enough about their fellow truckers to continue watching over them even after death. Drivers who died doing what they loved, but who found a way to keep on trucking in whatever form they could manage. The highway can be a lonely place, especially in the middle of the night when you're the only person awake for miles in any direction. But I don't think we're ever really alone out there. I think there are guardian spirits riding the highways with us, keeping us company, watching our backs, and ready to help when we need it most. I may never know who was following me in those mysterious trucks, or why they chose to watch over me during some of the most challenging drives of my career. But I'm grateful for their presence, and I hope that when my own driving days are over, I'll have the chance to return the favor for some other driver who needs a guardian angel riding in their mirrors. Because that's what truckers do for each other. We watch out for one another, we share the road, and we never leave a fellow driver to face the darkness alone, even after death, apparently. My name is Mark Thompson, and what I'm about to tell you is the reason I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live, no matter how desperate they might seem or how bad the weather gets. It's also the reason I installed dash cameras and a GPS tracker in my truck, and why I always call my wife at predetermined times when I'm on long hauls, just so someone knows exactly where I am and when. I've been driving truck for 15 years, and I've always prided myself on being one of the good guys. The kind of driver who stops to help stranded motorists, who shares his coffee with other truckers at rest stops, who goes out of his way to be courteous and helpful to anyone who needs assistance. My company has commended me multiple times for going above and beyond, and I've trained several new drivers over the years. I mention this not to brag, but to establish that I'm not the kind of person who makes reckless decisions or ignores safety protocols without good reason. The night everything went wrong was a Thursday in late November. I was hauling a load of construction materials from Pittsburgh to Memphis, running south on I-77 through West Virginia, and then connecting to other interstates for the final leg into Tennessee. It was cold and raining, not quite freezing, but miserable weather for anyone who might be stuck outside. I was about 2 hours into my drive somewhere in the hills of southern West Virginia when I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb out, wearing what looked like a denim jacket and jeans. No umbrella, no rain gear, just standing there in the cold rain getting soaked. As my headlights swept over him, I could see that he was shivering and looked genuinely distressed. Now, picking up hitchhikers is against company policy for truckers. It's a liability issue, a safety issue, and potentially a legal issue depending on the cargo you're hauling. I'd never picked up a hitchhiker in 15 years of driving, and I'd trained other drivers to never do it under any circumstances. But this guy looked like he was in real trouble. The temperature was dropping, the rain was getting heavier, and we were in the middle of nowhere with no towns or truck stops for at least 20 miles in either direction. If I didn't help him, he might be standing out there for hours before another vehicle came along. I made a decision that I've regretted every day since. I pulled over. As I slowed my rig to a stop on the shoulder, I could see the hitchhiker in my mirrors jogging toward the passenger side of my truck. I rolled down the passenger window and called out to him. "You need a ride? I can take you to the next truck stop." "Thank you," he called back. His voice sounded normal, maybe a little hoarse from the cold, but nothing unusual. "I really appreciate this." I unlocked the passenger door and waited for him to climb up into the cab. That's when I got my first good look at him. He was probably in his 30s with dark hair that was plastered to his head from the rain. His clothes were soaked through and he was shivering violently. But something about his appearance seemed off, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "Where are you headed?" I asked as he settled into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the highway. "South," he said. "Just south." "Okay, well, there's a truck stop about 18 miles ahead. I can drop you there and maybe you can catch another ride from someone who's going farther in your direction." "That's very kind of you." His voice was polite, grateful, but there was something strange about the way he was sitting. He was facing straight ahead, not looking at me when he spoke, and he hadn't made any of the normal movements you'd expect from someone who'd just gotten out of the rain. No wiping his face, no wringing out his hair, no attempt to dry off or warm up. I turned up the heat in the cab and offered him a towel from my sleeper compartment. "You must be freezing. Here, dry yourself off." He took the towel but didn't use it, just held it in his lap and continued staring straight ahead through the windshield. "You been standing out there long?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "A while." "What happened? Car breakdown?" "Something like that." His answers were getting shorter and I was starting to feel uncomfortable about the situation. Most people who get picked up by a good Samaritan are pretty talkative. Grateful, chatty, eager to explain their situation and express their appreciation. This guy was giving me single-word answers and didn't seem interested in normal conversation. But I figured maybe he was just cold and tired, or maybe he was naturally shy. Some people don't like talking to strangers, even strangers who are helping them. We drove in silence for several miles. I kept checking my passenger mirror, trying to get a better look at the guy, but he continued facing straight ahead. The strange thing was that even though he'd been standing in the rain, he wasn't dripping water onto the seat or leaving wet marks on the upholstery. His clothes still looked damp, but it was as if the moisture wasn't real water. About 10 miles down the road, I tried starting another conversation. You from around here?" He turned to look at me for the first time since getting in the truck. He had no face. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was just smooth skin. Not scarred or deformed skin, but perfectly smooth flesh, as if facial features had never existed. The skin was pale and slightly translucent, and it seemed to shift and move slightly in the light from the dashboard. I jerked the steering wheel in shock and had to fight to keep the truck on the road. My heart started pounding, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my hands shake. "Jesus Christ!" I shouted. "What the hell are you?" The thing sitting in my passenger seat turned away from me and faced forward again. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from somewhere inside its head, even though it had no visible mouth. "I'm sorry you can see me," it said. "Most people can't." I was hyperventilating, trying to process what I was seeing while maintaining control of an 18-wheeler traveling at highway speed. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get this thing out of my truck, but I was trapped. I couldn't stop on the shoulder without putting myself in danger from passing traffic, and I couldn't force it out while we were moving. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "I just want to go home." "Where's home?" "I don't remember anymore." The thing's voice was becoming clearer, and I realized it wasn't just one voice, but several voices speaking in unison. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all saying the same words at the same time. "How long have you been out here?" "I don't know. Time doesn't work the same way for me anymore." I was approaching the truck stop I'd promised to take him to, but now I was terrified of letting this thing out in a place where there would be other people. What if it approached some other unsuspecting driver? What if it hurt someone? But as we got closer to the truck stop, the thing began to change. It was still facing forward, but I could see its reflection in the passenger side window, and the reflection looked different from what I was seeing directly. In the reflection, it had a face, not the smooth, featureless surface I could see when I looked at it directly, but the face of a normal human being. Middle-aged, with tired eyes and a sad expression, wearing clothes that looked like they were from several decades earlier. "You can see my real face in the reflection," it said, apparently noticing where I was looking. The math didn't work out. At 30 miles per hour for 2 hours, I should have covered 60 miles at most. But according to my GPS, I was exactly where I should be if I had been driving at normal highway speeds for the entire night. It was as if the time I'd spent driving through the supernatural fog hadn't counted toward my actual travel time. I pulled over at the first truck stop I could find and sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd experienced. My hands were still shaking, and I could still smell traces of that swamp water odor on my clothes. But what really unsettled me was the evidence of what had happened. My truck's exterior was covered with wet handprints, dozens of them from different-sized hands all over the cab and trailer. The handprints were clearly visible in the truck stop's bright lighting, and they looked like they'd been made by hands that had been underwater for a long time. Inside the cab, my windows had fogged up despite the fact that the air conditioning had been running. When I wiped away the condensation, I found more handprints on the inside of the glass, as if the figures from the fog had somehow reached through the windows to touch the interior surfaces. Most disturbing of all, my electronic logbook showed a gap in the recorded data. According to the device, I had been driving normally until about 11 p.m. Then there was no data for approximately 2 hours. Then normal driving resumed around 1 a.m. It was as if those 2 hours had simply been erased from time. I completed my delivery to Charleston the next morning, but I was so shaken by the experience that I called my dispatcher and asked to be assigned to routes that didn't require night driving through remote areas. When I got home, I did some research on the 1937 flood that the nurse had mentioned. What I found made my blood run cold. The Ohio River flood of 1937 was indeed one of the worst natural disasters in the region's history. The river crested at nearly 80 feet above its normal level, inundating communities along its entire length. In the area where I'd encountered the fog, the flood had been particularly devastating. The town of Portsmouth was completely submerged, with water covering the main streets to a depth of several feet. Highway 52, which runs along the river, was underwater for weeks. Hundreds of people died in the flood, many of them while trying to evacuate along the very highway I'd been driving. I found newspaper accounts from 1937 that described rescue efforts along Highway 52. Many of the victims had been found wearing the types of clothing I'd seen in the fog: business suits, work clothes, school uniforms, and even wedding dresses from people who had been caught in the rising waters while attending social events. One article specifically mentioned a nurse named Margaret Sullivan, who had died while trying to help evacuate patients from a hospital that was in the flood's path. The description of her uniform matched what I'd seen on the woman who had given me directions. I also discovered that Highway 52 had a reputation among local drivers for being haunted. Several people reported encountering mysterious fog in the same area where I'd had my experience, and some claimed to have seen figures from the 1937 flood walking along the roadside. Most of these reports had been dismissed as folklore or the result of driver fatigue, but the details were remarkably consistent with what I'd experienced. Over the next few months, I tried to continue my trucking career, but I found that I was constantly nervous about driving through areas that might have histories of natural disasters or tragic events. Every time I encountered fog or unusual weather conditions, I would think about those ghostly figures and wonder if I was about to be pulled back into some supernatural replay of past events. I lasted about 6 more months as a trucker before deciding that the stress wasn't worth it. I went back to school and became a medical technician, which keeps me off the highways and in well-lit, populated areas where supernatural encounters are less likely. But I still think about that night on Highway 52 and about the hundreds of people who died in the 1937 flood. I think about how they might still be there, trapped in that moment when the rising waters claimed their lives, still trying to find their way to safety along a highway that's been dry for decades. The nurse who gave me directions, Margaret Sullivan, if that's who it really was, had referred to the fog as bringing me to the wrong time. I think she meant that the supernatural mist was a kind of temporal anomaly, a place where past and present intersect, where the dead continue to experience their final moments over and over again. And sometimes living people driving through that area at the wrong time get caught up in the replay, become temporary participants in a tragedy that happened more than 80 years ago. I don't know why I was able to escape when others might not have been so fortunate. Maybe it was because I listened to the nurse's advice about staying on high ground. Maybe it was because I was respectful of the spirits I encountered rather than trying to dismiss them or drive through them aggressively. Or maybe I was just lucky. But I do know that there are stretches of Highway 52 that should be avoided during certain weather conditions, especially when fog is rising from the Ohio River. Because that fog might not be natural weather at all. It might be the ghostly remnant of one of the worst floods in American history, still claiming victims decades after the waters receded. If you ever find yourself driving through Ohio River Valley and you encounter thick greenish fog that seems to move independently of the wind, turn around and find an alternate route. If you see figures walking along the roadside wearing clothing from bygone eras, don't stop to investigate. And if a nurse in a 1930s uniform approaches your truck and gives you directions, listen carefully and follow her advice exactly. She might be the only thing standing between you and becoming a permanent part of a tragedy that's been replaying itself for more than 80 years. The flood of 1937 claimed hundreds of lives along the Ohio River. But some of those victims are still there, still trying to help other travelers avoid the same fate they suffered. The least we can do is pay attention when they try to warn us about the dangers that lie hidden in the fog. My name is Dave Clark, and what I'm about to tell you happened to my twin brother Danny and me 4 years ago on what should have been a routine run from Columbus to Cleveland. Danny and I have been driving team for 8 years. He drives days, I drive nights, and we've developed a system that lets us cover more miles than most solo drivers while still staying legal on our hours. We're identical twins, which sometimes confuses dispatchers and customers, but it's actually been an advantage in trucking. We think alike, communicate without having to explain much, and trust each other completely. In 8 years of team driving, we've never had a serious disagreement about route choices, scheduling, or how to handle difficult situations. That night, we were hauling a load of office furniture from a manufacturer in Columbus up to a distribution center in Cleveland. It was a high-value load, but not particularly heavy, and we were making excellent time despite some construction delays around Columbus. Danny had been driving since early morning, and we'd switched positions around 6 p.m. so he could get some rest while I drove the night shift. The plan was for me to push through to Cleveland, arriving early enough for Danny to take over for the delivery appointment the next morning. Everything was going smoothly until our GPS started malfunctioning around 10 p.m. We were on I-71 North, about 30 miles south of Mansfield, when the GPS screen started flickering and showing conflicting information. One moment it showed us on the correct route with normal directions to Cleveland. The next moment it was displaying roads that didn't seem to exist and suggesting exits that I couldn't see on the highway signs. "Danny, wake up," I called to my brother in the sleeper. "I think we've got a navigation problem." Danny climbed up into the passenger seat and looked at the GPS display. Like me, he could see that something was seriously wrong with the system. "That's weird," he said. "It's showing 3 different routes to Cleveland, and none of them match what the road signs are saying." I pulled out our backup GPS unit. We always carry 2 independent navigation systems just in case one fails. But when Danny powered it up, it showed the same confusing information as the primary unit. "Both GPS systems can't be wrong at the same time," Danny said. "Something's interfering with the satellite signals." We tried using the GPS on our cell phones, but they were showing the same erratic behavior. Flickering between different route displays, suggesting turns onto roads that weren't marked on any signs, and giving arrival times that varied by hours from one moment to the next. "Let's just follow the highway signs," I suggested. "I-71 north to Cleveland, same as we've driven dozens of times before. We don't need GPS for a route we know by heart." But as we continued north, the highway signs started becoming inconsistent as well. Some signs showed the correct distances to Cleveland and other familiar cities, while others displayed town names we'd never heard of and mileages that didn't make sense. One sign said, "Cleveland 47 miles, while the next sign, just 2 miles down the road, said Cleveland 63 miles. "This is getting seriously weird," Danny said. "It's like we're driving through some kind of dead zone where nothing electronic works properly." Around 10:30 p.m. we saw an exit, sign that neither of us remembered from previous trips on this route. It was for a town called Millbrook, with a distance listed as 2 miles. The sign looked official, with the same design and fonts used by the Ohio Department of Transportation, but neither Danny nor I could recall ever seeing it before. "You ever hear of Millbrook?" I asked Danny. "Never. And we've driven this route at least 50 times. Our fuel gauge was showing about a quarter tank, which should have been plenty to reach Cleveland." But given the confusion with our navigation systems, I was starting to worry about getting lost or taking a wrong turn that would add significant mileage to our trip. "What do you think about taking this exit and looking for a gas station?" I suggested. "Maybe we can get directions from someone local and figure out where we are." Danny agreed, so I took the Millbrook exit. The off-ramp led to a 2-lane road that headed east through farmland and patches of forest. After about 2 miles, we crested a small hill and saw the lights of a town spread out in the valley below. Millbrook looked like a typical small Ohio town, a main street lined with shops and restaurants, residential neighborhoods spreading out from the commercial center, and the usual mix of newer buildings and older structures that you'd find in any rural community that had grown up around farming and small industry. The strange thing was how quiet it was. It was 10:45 p.m. on a weeknight, so I didn't expect to see heavy traffic or lots of activity. But as we drove down the main street of Millbrook, we didn't see any traffic at all. No cars parked on the street, no pedestrians, no signs of life anywhere. But all the buildings were lit up as if they were open for business. The street lights were on, the traffic lights were cycling through their normal patterns, and most of the businesses had their signs illuminated and their windows bright. A diner had its open sign glowing. A gas station's pumps were lit and appeared to be operational, and even a movie theater was displaying current films on its marquee. "This place looks open, but where is everybody?" Danny asked. We drove the length of Main Street twice, looking for any sign of human activity. The businesses all appeared to be operational. We could see lights on inside buildings, electronic displays showing current information, and even what looked like fresh food displayed in restaurant windows. But there were no people anywhere. No customers, no employees, no residents visible in any of the houses we passed. "Maybe there's some kind of community event," I suggested. "Town meeting, high school football game, something that would draw everyone to the same place." We found the high school and checked the football stadium. It was empty, but the lights were on and the scoreboard was displaying what looked like current game information. We checked the town square, thinking there might be some kind of festival or gathering, empty, but all the benches and decorative lighting suggested it was maintained and used regularly. We even drove through the residential neighborhoods looking for any signs of life. Every house was lit up, many had cars in the driveways, and we could see television screens flickering in living room windows. But we didn't see a single person anywhere. "This is seriously creepy," Danny said. "It's like everyone in town just vanished." We decided to stop at the gas station to fuel up and see if we could find someone to give us directions. As we pulled up to the pumps, we noticed that everything appeared to be functioning normally. The digital displays were working, the credit card readers were active, and the pumps were ready to dispense fuel. I swiped my company credit card and began fueling the truck while Danny went inside to look for an attendant and maybe buy some snacks. A few minutes later, Danny came back out with a strange expression on his face. "Dave, you need to see this." I finished fueling and followed Danny inside the gas station. The interior was brightly lit and fully stocked, with fresh food in the refrigerated sections and current magazines on the racks. The cash register was on and appeared to be functional. But there was no one behind the counter. "Look at this," Danny said, pointing to a newspaper rack near the entrance. The local newspaper was dated that day, with a headline that made both of us stop cold. "Twin truckers die in highway accident." The subheading read, "Dave and Danny Clark killed when truck overturns near Millbrook exit." Danny and I looked at each other with growing horror. We read the article, which described how 2 twin brothers driving a furniture delivery truck had died when their rig overturned after taking the Millbrook exit on I-71. The accident had supposedly occurred around 10:30 p.m., approximately the same time we had taken that exit. "This has got to be some kind of joke," I said. "Or maybe it's about different people with the same names." but the article included details that were too specific to be coincidental. It mentioned our trucking company, described the load of office furniture we were hauling, and even included our truck number and license plate. According to the newspaper, we were both dead. "We need to get out of here," Danny said. "Right now." We ran back to our truck and climbed into the cab. I started the engine and began driving toward what I hoped was the exit back to I-71, but nothing looked familiar. The streets that had led us into town seemed to have changed, and we couldn't find the road that we'd taken from the highway. We drove around Millbrook for another 20 minutes trying to find our way out, but every street seemed to lead back to the town center. It was as if the town was designed to trap visitors, with a street layout that didn't follow normal logic. "Look at this," Danny said, pointing to a street sign. The sign read Clark Street, and it was pointing toward a residential area we hadn't explored yet. "That's our last name," I said. "Probably just a coincidence." But as we turned onto Clark Street, we saw something that made us both panic. There were two houses at the end of the street with mailboxes that read D. Clark and D. Clark, one for each of our first names. The houses were identical to the homes we'd grown up in, complete with the same paint colors, landscaping, and architectural details that we remembered from our childhood. "This isn't real," Danny said. "This can't be real." I accelerated away from Clark Street and continued looking for a way out of town. But now every street sign seemed to reference our lives somehow. Furniture Avenue, a reference to the load we were carrying. Columbus Road, where we'd started our trip. Cleveland Boulevard, our destination. It was as if the town was constructed from details of our own lives, like an elaborate stage set designed specifically to trap us. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving in circles, we found a road that led uphill away from the town center. As we climbed the hill, I could see lights that looked like they might be highway traffic in the distance. But when we reached the top of the hill and looked back at Millbrook, the town was gone. Not dark, not empty, but completely gone. The valley where we'd seen streets and buildings and lights was now just empty farmland, with no sign that a town had ever existed there. We continued toward what we hoped was I-71 and eventually found an on-ramp that led back to the interstate. Our GPS systems immediately started working normally again, showing us exactly where we were and providing clear directions to Cleveland. We drove the rest of the way to Cleveland in silence, both of us trying to process what we'd experienced. When we arrived at our delivery location the next morning, everything was completely normal. The customer was expecting us, our paperwork was in order, and there were no problems with the delivery. It wasn't until later that day, when we were driving back toward Columbus, that we decided to look for the Millbrook exit again. We drove the entire length of I-71 between Columbus and Cleveland, checking every exit sign and watching for any reference to Millbrook. There was no such exit. There was no sign that we'd ever left the interstate the night before. But when we checked our fuel gauge, we were missing exactly the amount of diesel that we should have used if we'd driven the extra miles into town and back. Over the next few months, Danny and I tried to research Millbrook, Ohio. We checked maps, historical records, census data, and local history websites. We found no evidence that a town by that name had ever existed in that area of Ohio. We also searched for any reports of trucking accidents involving twins named Clark. We found nothing that matched the newspaper story we'd seen. But we did find some disturbing information about that section of I-71. Over the years, there had been several reports of drivers taking exits that didn't exist on any official maps, visiting towns that couldn't be found on subsequent trips, and experiencing navigation equipment failures in that area. Most of these reports had been dismissed as driver fatigue, equipment malfunctions, or simple mistakes about locations and road numbers. But the details were remarkably consistent. Drivers would take an exit that seemed official and normal, visit a town that appeared fully functional but was mysteriously deserted, and then find themselves unable to locate the same exit on return trips. A few drivers reported seeing newspaper headlines about their own deaths while visiting these phantom towns. Others mentioned finding businesses or streets named after details from their own lives. Danny and I began to suspect that we'd experienced some kind of supernatural phenomenon, possibly related to the high number of traffic fatalities on that stretch of highway. Maybe we'd glimpsed some kind of afterlife destination for drivers who died in accidents, a place constructed from their own memories and experiences. Or maybe we'd temporarily died in an accident that we didn't remember and the newspaper headline had been accurate. Maybe Millbrook was a kind of way station for souls who weren't ready to accept their deaths, and we'd somehow found our way back to the living world. I don't have answers to these questions, and I'm not sure I want them. Danny and I continued driving team for another 2 years after the Millbrook experience, but we changed our routes to avoid that section of I-71. We also installed dash cameras that record continuously, just in case we ever have another experience that we need evidence for. Eventually, Danny decided to quit trucking and took a job as a mechanic at a truck dealership. He said the Millbrook experience had made him too nervous about long-haul driving, especially on unfamiliar routes or during night hours. I continued driving solo for another year, but I found that I was constantly worried about taking wrong exits or encountering navigation problems. Every time my GPS flickered or showed inconsistent information, I would think about that phantom town and wonder if I was about to disappear into another place that existed outside normal reality. I'm retired from trucking now, working at a shipping company doing local deliveries and office work. It's less money than long-haul driving, but it lets me sleep in my own bed every night and doesn't require me to navigate through the kind of remote areas where phantom towns might be hiding. Danny and I still talk about that night sometimes, usually when we've had a few beers and the conversation turns to the strangest experiences we had during our trucking years. We never did figure out what really happened in Millbrook, or if we actually died that night and somehow came back, but we both agree on one thing. There are places on America's highways that exist outside the normal rules of geography and physics. Places where lost souls might find themselves after fatal accidents. Places constructed from memory and regret, and the desire to continue traveling roads that they'll never complete. If you're ever driving late at night and your GPS starts malfunctioning, if you start seeing exit signs for towns you've never heard of, be very careful about taking those exits. You might find yourself in a place where the newspaper headlines have already been written, where the streets are named after details from your own life, and where the only residents are the ghosts of travelers who took the same wrong turn years or decades before. Some towns exist to welcome the living. Others exist to collect the dead. Make sure you know which kind you're visiting before you take that exit ramp, because finding your way back to the world of the living might be more difficult than you think. My name is Amanda Foster, and I need to tell you about the most terrifying night of my life, which also happened to be the night that convinced me trucking wasn't the career for me. I was 24 years old, fresh out of CDL school, and had just completed my first solo run after finishing training with a mentor driver. I was proud, confident, and excited about starting my new career as an independent long-haul driver. I should have been more careful about taking advice from experienced truckers about which routes to avoid, especially at night. The load I was hauling was a shipment of medical equipment from a manufacturer in Cincinnati down to a hospital in Charleston, West Virginia. It was valuable cargo, but not particularly heavy, and the delivery schedule gave me plenty of time to make the trip safely. I'd chosen to run Highway 52 south along the Ohio River because it was scenic and had light traffic, and I thought it would be a good route for building my confidence as a new driver. My mentor, an experienced driver named Ruth Kowalski, had warned me about Highway 52. "It's a beautiful drive during the day," she'd said, "but some stretches of that road can be tricky at night. If you're going to run 52, try to time it so you're through the worst sections before dark." I'd nodded and thanked her for the advice, but I didn't ask for specifics about which sections were problematic or why they might be dangerous. I was young and overconfident, and I figured I could handle whatever challenges the road might present. That was my first mistake. I left Cincinnati around 4 p.m., which should have put me in Charleston by late evening. But I ran into unexpected delays, construction traffic around Portsmouth, a mandatory rest break that took longer than planned, and a fuel stop where I had to wait in line behind several other trucks. By the time I reached the section of Highway 52 that runs between Portsmouth and Ironton, it was almost 11 p.m. and completely dark. That's where I encountered the fog. It appeared suddenly, rising from the Ohio River like steam from a boiling kettle. One moment I had clear visibility for several miles ahead. The next moment I was driving through fog so thick I could barely see the front of my truck. I immediately slowed down to about 30 miles per hour and turned on my hazard lights. The fog was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the thin, wispy fog you sometimes encounter in the morning, but dense, almost solid-looking mist that seemed to have weight and substance. But the strangest thing about this fog was that it wasn't uniform. Instead of the normal gray or white color you'd expect, this fog had an almost greenish tint, and it seemed to move independently of any wind patterns. Tendrils of mist would reach across the road like fingers, and patches of clearer air would open and close like windows. As I crept along the highway, trying to stay in my lane by following the centerline reflectors, I began to see shapes moving in the fog. At first, I thought they were other vehicles, maybe cars with their headlights dimmed by the thick mist. But the shapes were moving too slowly and erratically to be normal traffic. They would appear briefly in my headlight beams, then disappear into the fog before I could get a clear look at them. After about 10 minutes of driving through this supernatural mist, I realized that the shapes weren't vehicles at all. They were people. Walking along the highway, standing on the shoulder, crossing the road directly in front of my truck. All of them appeared to be dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and all of them moved with the slow, aimless gait of people who had nowhere specific to go. I slammed on my brakes when a figure stepped directly into my lane about 50 feet ahead of me. As my truck shuddered to a stop, I got a clear look at the person in my headlights. It was an elderly man wearing a suit that looked like it was from the 1940s or 1950s. His clothes were soaked through as if he'd been walking in heavy rain, and his hair was plastered to his skull. But the most unsettling thing about him was his eyes. They were completely white, with no visible pupils, and they seemed to glow slightly in the reflection of my headlights. The man stood in front of my truck for maybe 10 seconds, staring directly at me through the windshield. Then he turned and walked slowly toward the shoulder of the road, disappearing into the fog. My hands were shaking as I put the truck back in gear and continued creeping forward. But within minutes I encountered more figures, a woman in a 1960s-style dress, a child in overalls, a man in work clothes that looked decades out of date. All of them had the same soaked clothing, the same white glowing eyes, and the same slow, purposeless movement. I tried using my CB radio to contact other drivers, thinking maybe someone could help me understand what I was experiencing. But all I got was static, interrupted occasionally by what sounded like voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. My cell phone had no signal, and my GPS was showing conflicting information, sometimes indicating that I was on Highway 52 as expected, sometimes showing me in locations that didn't make sense. But the worst part of the experience was the temperature. Despite the fog, which you'd normally expect to be cool and damp, the air inside my truck was getting warmer. Not the comfortable warmth of the heating system, but an oppressive, humid heat that made it hard to breathe. And with the rising temperature came a smell that I'll never forget. The musty, organic odor of a swamp or marsh, mixed with something else that reminded me of old, wet clothing. As I continued through the fog, more and more figures appeared. Sometimes they were alone, sometimes in small groups. They would materialize out of the mist, stand or walk for a few moments within range of my headlights, then disappear again. None of them seemed threatening exactly, but there was something deeply unsettling about their presence. They appeared to be aware of my truck, but they didn't react to it with fear or curiosity the way living people would. They just observed, with those strange white eyes, and then moved on to whatever mysterious business occupied them. After what felt like hours of driving through this supernatural fog, I began to notice that some of the figures were approaching my truck more closely. A woman in a water-damaged wedding dress walked alongside my driver's side for several hundred yards, keeping pace with my slow progress. She never looked directly at me, but I could see her reflection in my side mirror, and her face was pale and bloated as if she'd been underwater for a long time. A group of children in old-fashioned school clothes gathered around my truck when I stopped at what appeared to be an intersection, though I couldn't see any road signs or familiar landmarks. They pressed their faces against my windows, leaving wet handprints on the glass, but I couldn't hear any sounds they might have been making. An elderly woman in a nurse's uniform from what looked like the 1930s stood directly in front of my truck and wouldn't move when I tried to proceed. She held up her hand in a stop gesture, and when I tried to drive around her, she moved to block my path. Finally, she approached my driver's side window and gestured for me to roll it down. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open the window, but something about her demeanor suggested she was trying to help rather than harm me. Against my better judgment, I cracked the window about an inch. The smell of swamp water and decay immediately filled the cab, along with a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "You shouldn't be here, child. This road is not for the living." "I'm just trying to get to Charleston," I managed to say. "Can you tell me how to get back to the highway?" "You are on the highway, but you're driving through the wrong time. The fog brought you here to when the river claimed us all." "What do you mean?" "The flood of 1937, the worst in Ohio Valley history. Hundreds of us died when the river rose and took the highway. We've been here ever since, waiting for the waters to recede." I looked around and realized that what I'd been interpreting as fog might actually be something else entirely. A kind of supernatural replay of the flood that had devastated the Ohio River Valley in 1937. "How do I get out of here?" "Follow the high ground. Stay away from the river. And whatever you do, don't stop until you reach living land." The nurse pointed toward what appeared to be a slight rise in the road ahead, then stepped back from my truck and disappeared into the mist. I followed her directions, staying on what seemed to be the highest parts of the roadway and avoiding areas where the fog was thickest. As I drove, I began to notice that the figures in the fog were becoming less distinct, more transparent, as if they were fading away. The temperature in my cab began to drop back to normal, and the oppressive smell of swamp water gradually dissipated. After another hour of careful driving, I emerged from the fog into clear night air. I was back on Highway 52, with normal visibility and familiar landmarks visible in my headlights. But when I checked my location on GPS, I discovered that I had somehow traveled nearly 50 miles while driving through the fog, despite maintaining a speed of no more than 30 miles per hour for what couldn't have been more than 2 hours. Story 10. Midnight Horns on the Abandoned Overpass. My name is Pete Kowalski. Old Pete to most of the drivers who know me, and I've been running highways for 42 years. I've seen everything you can imagine on America's roads, survived the CB radio craze of the 70s, watched the trucking industry change from independent operators to corporate fleets, and driven millions of miles without a single major accident. But 3 weeks ago, I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the roads I've spent my career traveling. I was making what I figured would be one of my last runs before retirement, a load of farm equipment from Kansas City to a dealer in Columbus, Ohio. It was a route I'd driven hundreds of times over the decades, taking I-70 east through Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and into Ohio. Nothing special, nothing challenging, just a routine run to help me reach the magic number of miles I needed for a full pension. The night it happened was a Tuesday in late October. I'd been driving since early morning and was making good time despite some construction delays around St. Louis. By the time I hit the Ohio border, it was approaching midnight, and I was feeling the fatigue that comes with being a 63-year-old man trying to keep up with a young man's schedule. I knew I should stop for my mandatory rest break, but I was only about 2 hours out from Columbus, and I wanted to push through and get the delivery done first thing in the morning. After 42 years, I was good at reading my own limitations, and I felt alert enough to finish the run safely. That's when I approached the overpass. It was a bridge I'd driven under thousands of times. Nothing special, just one of dozens of overpasses that carry local roads over I-70 in central Ohio. But as my headlights illuminated the structure ahead, I noticed something that hadn't been there on previous trips. The overpass was blocked off with orange construction barriers and warning signs indicating that it was scheduled for demolition. Heavy machinery was parked on the bridge deck, and the guardrails had been removed in preparation for tearing down the old structure. I'd driven this route just 3 weeks earlier, and the overpass had been in normal use then. It seemed strange that it would be scheduled for demolition so quickly, but highway infrastructure projects often move faster than drivers expect. As I passed under the abandoned overpass, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of an air horn, the distinctive blast of a truck's horn echoing from above. I looked up through my windshield as I passed under the bridge, but I could see only the dark silhouette of construction equipment against the night sky. No truck, no headlights, no movement of any kind. But the horn blast came again, louder and more insistent, clearly coming from the overpass above me. I grabbed my CB microphone and tried to raise whoever was up there. "Driver on the overpass, this is eastbound on 70. You got your ears on?" No response on the CB, just the usual static and occasional chatter from other truckers. The horn blasts continued as I drove away from the overpass, fading into the distance but remaining audible for several miles. It wasn't random honking. It was a deliberate pattern, the kind of signal that experienced truckers use to communicate with each other when radio communication isn't possible. 3 short blasts, followed by 2 long ones repeated over and over. I knew that pattern. It was an old signal that truckers used in the days before CB radios were common, a way of warning other drivers about dangers ahead. 3 short, 2 long meant slow down, hazard ahead. But what hazard? I-70 ahead of me was clear with light traffic and good visibility. My truck was running smoothly with no mechanical problems or warning indicators. The weather was perfect, and I was familiar with every mile of highway between my current position and Columbus. Still, 42 years of driving had taught me to respect warnings from other truckers, even when I couldn't see the source of the danger they were reporting. I slowed down from 65 to 55 miles per hour and increased my following distance behind the few other vehicles on the highway. Over the next 20 miles, I kept expecting to encounter whatever hazard the horn signals had been warning me about. Construction zone, accident, weather conditions, police activity. Something that would explain why another driver had been so insistent about getting my attention. but the highway remained clear and safe all the way to Columbus. I made my delivery the next morning and was preparing to deadhead back to Kansas City when I decided to investigate the overpass where I'd heard the horn blasts. I wanted to see if there was indeed a demolition project in progress and maybe find out if anyone else had heard the mysterious truck horn. When I reached the overpass, I found something that shook me to the core. The bridge was indeed scheduled for demolition, according to signs posted by the Ohio Department of Transportation. But the demolition had been completed 3 days earlier. The overpass had been completely torn down and removed, leaving only the concrete support pillars and some scattered debris. There was no bridge deck, no construction equipment, no place where a truck could have been parked to sound its horn. But I had driven under an intact overpass just 8 hours earlier. I was certain of what I'd seen. Construction barriers, warning signs, heavy machinery, and a bridge deck that was solid enough to support equipment and vehicles. I pulled over and walked around the area looking for any explanation for what I'd experienced. The demolition work appeared to have been completed professionally, with all debris removed and the site cleaned up. Based on the condition of the concrete and the vegetation growing around the support pillars, the bridge had been gone for several days at minimum. I talked to a highway maintenance crew that was working in the area, and they confirmed that the overpass had been demolished on the previous Saturday, 3 days before my trip through the area. 40-year-old bridge, the crew chief told me. Been scheduled for replacement for years, but they finally decided it wasn't worth the expense. Traffic patterns changed, and that road doesn't carry enough vehicles anymore to justify maintaining the overpass. I asked if he'd heard any reports of strange sounds or unusual activity in the area since the demolition. "Funny you should ask," he said. "We've had a couple of drivers call the highway department about hearing truck horns around here at night. Always the same story. Horn blasts coming from where the old bridge used to be." "What do you think is causing it?" The crew chief shrugged. "Could be atmospheric effects, echoes from other highways, maybe just imagination. Drivers who run this route regularly sometimes take a while to adjust when familiar landmarks disappear. But I knew what I'd experienced wasn't imagination or atmospheric effects. I'd driven under a solid bridge, seen construction, equipment with my own eyes, and heard horn blasts that followed a specific pattern designed to warn other truckers about danger. That night, I called my dispatcher and told him I needed to take some time off to think about my retirement plans. I didn't mention the supernatural experience. How could I? But something about encountering a ghost bridge had made me realize that my time on the highways was coming to an end. Over the next few days, I did some research on the demolished overpass and the road it had carried. What I found convinced me that I'd experienced something genuinely supernatural. The overpass had been built in 1963 and had carried County Road 47 over I-70 for nearly 40 years. It was a relatively minor road that connected small farming communities, and traffic had declined steadily as rural populations moved to cities and farming operations consolidated. But in 1982, there had been a fatal truck accident on that overpass. A driver named Jim Morrison, no relation to the rock star, had been hauling a load of grain from a farm to an elevator in Columbus when he lost control of his rig on the overpass. The truck had crashed through the guardrail and plunged off the bridge onto I-70 below, killing Morrison and 2 passengers in a car that was struck by the falling truck. The accident report indicated that Morrison had been driving the same route I was running, farm equipment and grain loads from the Kansas City area to Columbus. He'd been making the drive for 15 years and knew the road well. But on that October night in 1982, something had caused him to lose control at the worst possible place, the center of the overpass, where a crash would endanger traffic on the interstate below. The investigation had never determined exactly what caused the accident. Morrison's truck was mechanically sound, The weather was clear and there were no other vehicles involved. The best guess was that he'd fallen asleep at the wheel, but his logbooks indicated he was well within legal driving hours and should have been alert. One detail from the accident report caught my attention. Witnesses reported that just before the crash, Morrison had been sounding his air horn in a repetitive pattern, 3 short blasts followed by 2 long ones. The same pattern I'd heard coming from the demolished overpass. I began to suspect that Jim Morrison was still up there, still trying to warn other drivers about the danger he'd encountered 30 years ago. Maybe he'd seen something that night that wasn't recorded in the accident report. Black ice, a mechanical failure that wasn't discovered, an animal in the road, some hazard that had caused him to lose control. And maybe his spirit was still trying to prevent other drivers from meeting the same fate. I decided to test this theory by driving through the area again, this time at approximately the same time of night that Morrison's accident had occurred. The second time I approached the demolished overpass, I was ready for what I might encounter. I had my CB radio tuned to channel 19, my cell phone ready to record any sounds, and I was paying careful attention to my surroundings. As I approached the location where the bridge had once stood, I could see it again. The intact overpass, the construction barriers, the heavy machinery parked on the bridge deck. Just as solid and real as it had been the first time. And just as I passed underneath, the air horn began sounding. 3 short, 2 long, repeated over and over with increasing urgency. But this time I also heard something else. A voice on the CB radio, faint and distorted, but clearly audible. "Eastbound big truck, this is overpass. You got black ice ahead at mile marker 97. Repeat, black ice at mile marker 97. Reduce speed immediately." I checked my location. Mile marker 97 was about 5 miles ahead. The weather was clear and well above freezing, with no conditions that would create ice on the roadway. But I remembered Morrison's accident report and the unexplained loss of control that had killed him. I slowed down to 45 miles per hour and turned on my hazard lights. At mile marker 97, I encountered a massive pothole that had opened up in the right lane, a road hazard that would have been invisible in the dark and could easily have caused a loaded truck to lose control. I was able to safely navigate around the pothole because I'd been warned about it and had reduced my speed appropriately. But if I'd been driving at normal highway speed, the sudden impact could have caused exactly the kind of loss of control that had killed Jim Morrison in 1982. Morrison had died trying to warn other drivers about a hazard he'd encountered. 30 years later, his spirit was still trying to complete that mission. Still sounding warning signals from an overpass that existed only in the supernatural realm. I reported the pothole to the Ohio Department of Transportation, and it was repaired within 2 days. But I continued thinking about Morrison and the dedication he'd shown to protecting other drivers even after death. That's when I made my decision to retire from trucking. Not because I was afraid of supernatural encounters, but because I realized that Morrison's story was also my story. I was a veteran driver with decades of experience, running familiar routes, getting close to the end of my career. If something happened to me on the highway, an accident, a medical emergency, a moment of inattention, would I be able to accept it and move on? Or would I be trapped like Morrison, still trying to warn other drivers about dangers they couldn't see? I submitted my retirement paperwork the following week. 42 years was enough. I'd earned my pension, saved enough money to live comfortably, and accumulated enough memories to last a lifetime. But before I turned in my keys for the last time, I made one final trip through the area where Morrison's ghost was still sounding his warnings. This time, when I heard the horn blasts and the CB radio warning, I responded, "Overpass, this is eastbound big truck. Message received and understood. Thank you for the warning, driver. You can rest easy now. We're all watching out for each other down here." The horn blasts stopped immediately. The demolished overpass flickered and disappeared, leaving only the concrete support pillars and the empty space where the bridge had once carried traffic between small farming communities. I never heard Morrison's warnings again, and according to the highway department, there have been no more reports of mysterious horn blasts in that area. I think he finally found peace, knowing that his message had been received and that other drivers were taking the warnings seriously. That's the way it should be in trucking. Experienced drivers looking out for newcomers, veterans sharing their knowledge with the next generation, and everyone working together to keep the highways safe. Sometimes that cooperation continues even after death, when drivers who've spent their careers protecting others refuse to let a little thing like dying stop them from doing their job. Jim Morrison died in 1982, but he spent 30 more years trying to prevent other truckers from encountering the same hazard that killed him. That's the kind of dedication and brotherhood that made me proud to be a part of the trucking industry. Now that I'm retired, I spend my time teaching new drivers at a local truck driving school. I tell them about road safety, proper maintenance, and how to stay alert during long drives. But I also tell them about Jim Morrison and the Ghost Bridge, because I want them to understand that trucking is more than just a job. It's a calling. And sometimes that calling doesn't end when your driving days are over. Final thoughts. The roads we travel. These 10 stories represent just a fraction of the supernatural experiences that truck drivers encounter on America's highways every year. Most drivers never report these incidents officially. How could they? Who would believe stories about screaming ghosts, disappearing convoys, and phantom hitchhikers? But among truckers themselves, these stories are shared in truck stops and over CB radios, passed down from experienced drivers to newcomers and remembered long after the miles have been driven and the loads delivered. They remind us that the highways we travel are more than just ribbons of asphalt connecting cities and towns. They're repositories of human experience, places where millions of people have lived and worked and sometimes died. The roads remember those experiences, and sometimes they share them with travelers who know how to listen. Every truck driver has encountered something on the highway that couldn't be easily explained. A moment of strange intuition that prevented an accident. A voice on the radio warning about dangers that weren't visible. A feeling of being watched or protected during a long, lonely night drive. Maybe these experiences are supernatural, evidence that the spirits of deceased drivers continue to watch over the highways they once traveled. Maybe they're psychological phenomena, the product of fatigue and isolation and the human need to find meaning in random events. Or maybe there's something else entirely, reminders that we're all connected, that the truckers who drove these roads before us left something behind, and that those who come after us will be influenced by the experiences we're having today. Whatever the explanation, these stories serve an important purpose. They remind us to pay attention while we're driving, to respect the dangers and mysteries of highway travel, and to look out for our fellow drivers who might need help or guidance. They also remind us that some journeys don't end when we reach our destination. The roads we travel become part of us, and we become part of them. The miles we drive, the loads we haul, and the lives we touch along the way create ripples that extend far beyond our own time behind the wheel. So the next time you're driving late at night on a lonely highway, remember the stories in this collection. Listen carefully to your CB radio. Pay attention to unusual sounds or sights, and don't dismiss experiences that seem too strange to be real. Because the highways of America are full of mysteries, and some of the best drivers, the ones who truly understand the road, are the ones who never finished their final runs. They're still out there, still driving, still trying to help the rest of us make it home safely. Listen for their warnings. Follow their guidance. And remember that trucking is more than just a profession. It's a brotherhood that extends beyond the boundaries of life and death. The road goes on forever, and so do the drivers who love it enough to never really leave. I pulled into the truck stop parking lot, my hands still shaking from adrenaline and fear. The thing in my passenger seat remained motionless, staring straight ahead. "This is where I said I'd drop you off," I said. "I know. But I need to tell you something first." "What?" The thing turned to look at me again, and this time I forced myself not to look away from that horrible blank face. "You're in danger. Not from me, but from something else. Something that's been following you." "Following me? What do you mean?" "There's something wrong with your truck. Something that's going to cause an accident if you don't fix it." I looked at my gauges and warning lights. Everything appeared normal. Oil pressure, coolant temperature, air pressure, all reading in the green. "I don't see any problems. Check your trailer brakes. The left rear assembly is about to fail." "How do you know that?" "Because I can see things that living people can't see. I can see the stress fractures in the metal, the wear patterns that haven't become visible yet. If you don't get it fixed before you reach the mountains in Virginia, you're going to have a runaway truck situation." I had no reason to trust this supernatural hitchhiker, but something about the urgency and its multiple voices made me take the warning seriously. Brake failure on a mountain grade is every trucker's worst nightmare, and I'd rather be overly cautious than end up as a statistic. "Okay," I said. "I'll have the brakes checked. Now can you please get out of my truck?" "Thank you for the ride," it said. "And Mark." I hadn't told it my name. "Your wife and daughters are worried about you. Call them when you get to Memphis." The thing opened the passenger door and climbed down from the cab. As soon as it was outside, it began to change. The featureless face started to develop normal human features: eyes, nose, mouth, and its rain-soaked clothes became dry and normal-looking. By the time it reached the ground, it looked like a completely ordinary middle-aged man in a denim jacket. It walked away from my truck toward the truck stop building, moving with the normal gait of a living person. I watched it go inside, presumably to ask for another ride from some other driver. I sat in my cab for several minutes, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress. But I could still smell the damp, cold odor that the thing had brought into the cab, and I could see wet handprints on the passenger door handle where it had gripped it while climbing down. More importantly, I couldn't shake the warning about my brakes. I walked around my trailer and did a visual inspection of the brake assemblies. Everything looked normal to my untrained eye, but I decided to have them checked by a professional as soon as possible. The truck stop had a maintenance bay that was open 24 hours, so I asked the mechanic to take a look at my trailer brakes, specifically the left rear assembly. What he found made my blood run cold. "You've got a stress fracture in the brake cam shaft," he said. "It's not visible from the outside, but I can feel it when I try to move the assembly. This thing is maybe 100 miles away from complete failure. What would happen if it failed while I was driving? Depends on where you were when it happened. On flat ground, probably nothing too serious. You'd lose braking power on that wheel, but your other brakes could compensate. But if it happened on a steep grade," he shook his head, "you'd be looking at a runaway truck situation. Very dangerous." The mechanic replaced the defective brake assembly, and I continued on to Memphis with a profound sense of unease. The supernatural hitchhiker had somehow known about a mechanical problem that wasn't visible to normal inspection, and its warning had probably saved my life. But I kept thinking about its parting words about my wife and daughters being worried about me. I'd told my wife I would call her when I reached Memphis, which was still several hours away. There was no reason for her to be worried yet, unless... I pulled out my cell phone and discovered that I had 17 missed calls from my wife, all within the past 2 hours. I called her immediately and she answered on the first ring. Mark, thank God, I've been trying to reach you for hours. What's wrong? What's happened? Amy was in a car accident. She's okay, just some bruises and a concussion, but the police needed to reach you. Your phone kept going straight to voicemail. Amy is my youngest daughter, a college student in Tennessee. The accident had happened around the time I'd picked up the hitchhiker, which would explain why I hadn't received any of the calls. My phone apparently hadn't been getting signal in that area. Is she really okay? She's fine, but she's asking for you. Can you come to the hospital when you finish your delivery? I finished the run to Memphis and went directly to the hospital, where I found Amy bruised but alert and grateful to see me. The doctors confirmed that she had a mild concussion and some bruising from the seatbelt, but no serious injuries. As I sat with her in the hospital room, I kept thinking about the hitchhiker's warning that my family was worried about me. It had somehow known about Amy's accident before I did, had known that my wife was desperately trying to reach me. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched missing persons reports and unsolved disappearances in West Virginia, looking for anyone who matched the description of the man I'd seen in the reflection. What I found was disturbing. There had been dozens of drivers who had vanished on highways in West Virginia over the past several decades. Some were found eventually, victims of accidents or medical emergencies, but others simply disappeared without a trace, leaving behind families who never learned what happened to their loved ones. One case in particular caught my attention. In 1987, a trucker named David Martinez had disappeared while driving through southern West Virginia. His truck was found abandoned on the shoulder of I-77 with no sign of what had happened to the driver. The case was never solved, and Martinez's family spent years searching for answers. The description of David Martinez matched the face I'd seen in the reflection of my passenger window. Middle-aged, tired-looking, wearing the kind of denim jacket that was popular in the 1980s. I began to suspect that the hitchhiker I'd picked up was the spirit of David Martinez, or one of the other drivers who had disappeared on those lonely West Virginia highways. Maybe he was trapped somehow, unable to move on, still trying to find his way home after decades of wandering. But why had he warned me about the brake failure and my family emergency? Maybe death had given him the ability to see things that living people couldn't see. Mechanical problems, future events, dangers that weren't immediately apparent. And maybe, having experienced the tragedy of disappearing without warning and leaving his own family to wonder what had happened, he was trying to prevent other drivers from suffering similar fates. I never reported the incident to my company or to law enforcement. How could I? Who would believe a story about a supernatural hitchhiker who warned me about brake failure and family emergencies? I would have sounded like a driver who'd been on the road too long and was starting to lose his grip on reality. But I did make some changes to how I operate. I had my truck equipped with better communication equipment, including a satellite phone that works even in remote areas with poor cell coverage. I installed dash cameras that record both the road ahead and the interior of the cab, just in case I ever need evidence of unusual experiences. And I started doing more frequent maintenance checks, especially on safety-critical systems like brakes. Most importantly, I stopped picking up hitchhikers entirely. Not because I'm afraid of helping people in genuine need, but because I learned that night that not everyone standing on the side of the highway is entirely alive. I've driven through that section of West Virginia several times since then, and I've never seen the hitchhiker again. But I have seen other lone figures standing by the roadside in remote areas, and something about their posture or their appearance makes me think they might not be entirely human. I always slow down when I see them, just in case they're genuinely living people who need help. But I don't stop anymore. Instead, I call 911 on my satellite phone and report the location of someone who appears to need assistance. Let the professionals handle it. They're better equipped to deal with situations that might not be what they appear to be. The experience taught me that there are things on America's highways that can't be explained by normal logic or science. Spirits of drivers who died far from home still trying to complete their final runs. Souls who became lost in the transition from life to death and now wander the roads they once traveled professionally. Some of these spirits might be malevolent, but I don't think the one I encountered was. I think David Martinez, or whoever it was trying to help me, trying to prevent me from experiencing the same fate he'd suffered. The brake warning probably saved my life, and the information about my family emergency allowed me to be there when my daughter needed me most. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the encounter despite how terrifying it was at the time. It reminded me that truckers look out for each other even after death. It made me more aware of the dangers of highway driving and more careful about maintaining my equipment. And it connected me to my family in a way that might not have happened otherwise. But it also taught me that some rides are too dangerous to offer, and some passengers are too lost to be helped by the living. If you're ever driving late at night and you see someone standing by the roadside who doesn't look quite right, who seems too still or too perfect or too desperate, trust your instincts. Call for help if you can, but don't stop.